meeting. We will now
This
take roll
meeting
call.
is being
Thank you, Ms.
recorded.
Ellis. You're muted.
Bauer,
Here.
Alonso,
Here.
Hooper,
Here.
Marzo,
Here.
Potter, Ryder,
Here.
Fisher.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Ellis. We will now move on to general public comment. General public comment is for items that are not on tonight's agenda. You'll be limited to 3 minutes, and I will let our moderator, Mr. Roberts, take over from here. Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I see 4 attendees are joining us tonight. If you would wish to participate in general public comment, you'll see a raise hand option at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and select that, and I will call on you in the order in which you've raised your hand. And it appears that no one is raising their hand for public comment. I will pass it back to Chair Bauer.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Roberts. We will now move on to agenda item number 4, which is committee comment. And tonight we'll start with our council liaison, Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I do want to report on the council meeting of last Monday, the 17th. We had an affordable housing workshop. Although it got started late, it was incredibly informative. And staff took feedback from the council members, really trying to figure out how to meet our RHNA numbers, particularly for the very low and low income housing, and then looking at our next cycle and how we're going to meet those numbers as well. And just wondering from Heather, is it possible to share copies of the slide presentations? Because there was some really great information in those.
Yes. Oh, I got a washcloth. Okay.
You bet. Let me mute Erica. Yes, I can definitely get my hands on those and send those out. If they're not already up on the council website, I'll check, and if they're up there, I'll send a link.
Thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. We'll now move on to the Pedestrian and Bicycle Committee, and that will be brought to us by Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. PBAC hasn't had a meeting since our last Planning Commission meeting, but I just wanted to say that I was excited that we're going to be talking about the climate action presentation and the VMT policy, just because that's come up several times in discussion in our PBAC meetings. And I know that that committee is anxious to see how these things end up getting implemented and how they'll make it easier to see active transit in our community. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hooper. And now we'll move on to the Tree Advisory Committee, which is Commissioner Marzo.
Thank you very much, Chair Bauer. The Tree Advisory Committee met last Wednesday, and the main topic of the discussion was getting our tree technical manual ready for advancement to, I believe it's coming to planning first, and other parts of the city department. So again, Chair Shribs has done an amazing job putting this technical manual together along with the other committee members. So I believe planning will be seeing it soon. There was also continuing discussion about the heritage tree list. That update is still continuing. And also there was a discussion on tree removal and replanting, and a review of many of the ordinances currently written into the city, and then also kind of a little bit of what else is going on in the counties within this county, and then other Bay Area counties as it relates to those ordinances and how we can help further advance the protection of trees, street trees, and mitigation for the removal of trees. So the tree technical manual should be coming your way soon, and it's chock full of great information. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Commissioner Marzo. And your report out reminded me that maybe I would mention that since you only have a few meetings left with us, that we'll be asking for another commissioner to take over their role as the advisory committee. So, and I'm sure Planning Manager Hines will speak about that at some point in the future. And I just wanted to remind everybody that maybe they could take some time and consider doing that, because I think it's a very worthwhile job. And we are a tree city here in Petaluma, and very proud to be. So it's a very important role. So,
May I add one thing, Chair?
Mm-hmm.
Just only that I assumed this role after Commissioner Alonso had served on it, and he did a really excellent job as a liaison, and it really has been a great committee to be a part of. So I would encourage all of the commissioners, if you have a little bit of extra time, it's a great group of people who care about our community, and I would encourage someone to step up, please. Thanks.
Commissioner Marzo, can you share when you meet?
Typically, it's on the third Wednesday of each month, I believe. Yeah, you know, but what's interesting is I really think that this committee's come a long way because of the tree technical manual and the kind of, you know, really hyper-focused goals that they have to address the, you know, the removal of trees, and how we can all participate in the protection and then the replacement of them. So it's been an eye-opener for me, just like sitting on PBAC, and it's a great experience.
Right, thank you. Commissioner Marzo, what time is the meeting at?
3:30
Okay.
on Wednesdays.
I just wanted to put that out
the
there.
third Wednesday of each month, but it's a
Okay.
Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Marzo. We'll now ask if any other commissioners have any other comment at this time. I don't think I see any, so we'll move on to staff comment, which will ask for the planning manager's report by Planning Manager Hines.
Good evening. A few updates. So following up on the discussion about the Tree Advisory Committee. So we usually elect or self-select members to serve at our first meeting in July for both the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee and the Tree Advisory Committee, are the two committees that a liaison from the Planning Commission sits on. So, and that will also be, the council will be appointing new members to our commissions, committees, and boards on, I believe it's the June 14th council meeting. So in July, we will also have new members seated for the commission. So just following up on that, following up on Council Member Fisher's report about council meetings, I also wanted to just close the loop that the all electric was the second reading happened, and so we are in that 30 days of the referendum period on that. Council approved a resolution authorizing staff to partner with SMART and Danco, affordable housing provider, on affordable housing sustainable communities grant application for the Corona Station site at Corona and McDowell. So that is an application that we have been working with Danco and SMART to look at that, to fund the station, bike and ped improvements in the area, and the affordable housing project. So that will be submitted in June, and I think we hear back in, I think it's October, on whether we would get those funds. The housing workshop, I will pass along the slides, and it was both a great discussion about some of the short-term policy discussions that the council may wish to have, but it also kind of kicked off the housing element update, if you will. It was some of the guest speakers that we had were from the general plan consulting team. So we had Veronica Tam, who will be doing the housing element, and Dina Belzar from Strategic Economics, who will be doing some of the economic aspects of the general plan. And we also had Allie Gaylord from MidPenn Housing, and Allie is a member of our general plan advisory committee. So the three of them were a nice complement to talk about some of the challenges with housing, and really kind of kick off that upcoming effort. And actually the timing was very appropriate. We just received the final draft allocations for our RHNA numbers. They are the same as the last, as what was recommended. So no change in the numbers from the last time we saw them, but this is the final draft. So we're now in an appeal period if jurisdictions want to appeal, but these numbers should be pretty close to final. And our RHNA is 1,910 housing units. So that is more than double the 745 that were our allocation for the fifth cycle. And that includes 499 very low units, 288 in the low income, 313 in the moderate, and 810 in the above moderate. So it's starting to kind of formalize and take shape the numbers that we're going to need to be working with as we update our housing element. Speaking of which, we had a general plan advisory committee meeting last week. So that committee, it was a good meeting, lots of collaboration and discussions, tried out some different tools for gathering information in the meeting format. And the second part of the meeting was starting to gather some information on topics to start laying out future discussions with the General Plan Advisory Committee. And then finally, the Public Art Committee meets on Thursday, and they are going to be talking with the consultants that are part of the General Plan team focused on culture and art to start talking about some of the existing conditions and priorities and community assets to be talking to about kind of that real specific topic of public art and culture. So that's my update for this evening.
Great, thank you very much, Planning Manager Hines. Are there any questions from commissioners about that report? No? Okay, well, we'll move on then to the approval of the minutes from the Tuesday, May 11th, 2021 meeting. Does anybody have any additions or changes or edits to that? No, I don't see any, so we'll go ahead and approve those minutes. And then we'll move on to our main event, which is a presentation by Patrick Carter on the discussion of the recently adopted climate emergency framework. Thank you very much, Mr. Carter. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair Bauer, Planning Commissioners, and Councilmember Fisher for inviting me here to discuss the climate emergency framework with you tonight. Chair Bauer said recently approved, but actually it was January that we approved it, so it's been in place for a while now, and I'm happy to report that we've made a lot of strides towards implementing some of those goals that are contained within it with our all electric and our gas ban and a bunch of actions that are coming forth in the near future. So happy to kind of kick off this discussion with the Planning Commission about where we go in the future. Apologies it's taken so long to get here, but really the purpose of this discussion is to kind of talk about the future of the climate emergency framework and how it ties into the roles of the Planning Commission and other committees and commissions throughout the city, and make sure that we're rowing in the same direction to meet the 2030 climate carbon neutrality goals that are set within that document, because it's going to be a big lift. And we really need everybody, all hands on deck to make it come into reality. I'm also joined tonight with our Climate Action Commission Chair, Ann Baker, who's joining us tonight to co-present and add some of that additional context behind some of the why of this. I'm gonna be talking about the what a lot and looking toward the future. And Ann is going to be there to kind of talk about if the Planning Commission has any questions about, what was the genesis of this goal, where was the community feedback that kind of led to this, as she was instrumental into that process, as was Councilmember Fisher, who was the liaison at the time of most of the work that happened on the development of the climate emergency framework. So with that preamble aside, I'll jump into sharing my screen. I hope everybody can see that. I'll close that out. Is everybody seeing the screen now? I will assume that that's a yes, as somebody would say no if that was a problem. For some reason, my other screen went away. There we go. Okay. The Climate Emergency Framework, presentation to the Planning Commission. Here we go. So the Climate Emergency Framework, this is what I hope to talk to you tonight, preamble aside, is what was the intent of the framework? What are the goals within it? Where can I go to learn more? And I being anybody that's watching this, not me, that'd be silly for me to talk about where I go, but you can go to the same place. And how is the Planning Commission involved in the future of this? So the intent of the Climate Emergency Framework is to establish common values. It's to set the broad goals for equity, climate justice, mitigation, sequestration, adaptation and social resilience, and community engagement. Those 4 topics there are sections of the Climate Emergency Framework. They're kind of how it was organized, because a lot of the goals contained within kind of fell into those 4 buckets. So that's, we're going to talk about the goals contained within each one of those sections, and I've included all of them in this presentation. And I know it's not great to always put walls of text in there, but I don't intend to read all of them. I intend to kind of go through the major themes of them, really just as a way to kind of start the thought process with the Planning Commission about how the goals of the Planning Commission intersect with the goals of the Climate Emergency Framework in those 4 sections. So the framework, the Climate Emergency Framework, really is a foundation. It's a foundational document, and it's to kind of organize us as a city to take future action. So the general plan process, the update process, has already been kicked off with Ramey and Associates. Contained within that general plan update process is the creation of a climate action and adaptation plan. And at the January 11th, I think it was January 11th meeting where the Climate Emergency Framework was adopted by the City Council, the Climate Action Commission submitted 15 priority actions to the City Council there as well. It's kind of like, here's the future with this framework, but really let's get started on these 15 actions from the get-go. And all this information you'll be able to reference in the future. I'll show you where to get it in a future slide. But all this is building towards a goal of being carbon neutral by 2030. So with the section on equity and climate justice, really the major themes in this is to identify where climate equity issues exist, to develop programs and benchmarks to address and track the equity issues, to improve Petaluma's transportation system, and that includes both the active transportation and making a more affordable public transportation system, and make the future really that allows all residents to live in a clean and healthy environment. So how do we go about setting these broad goals? How do we implement that? And I think there's a lot of intersection there with the Planning Commission, because a lot of these projects that will help implement it will be coming before the Planning Commission for consideration. And it's really going to be an interesting conversation, I think, with the Planning Commission about how those goals are realized through the projects that come before it for approvals. So moving on to mitigation and sequestration, the graph on the right-hand side of the slide shows our direct emissions. These are burning of fossil fuels and those emissions going into the atmosphere, contributing to our climate situation that we're finding ourselves in. The green line, the green bars are 2010 data, and the yellow bars are 2015 data. So we can see the first bucket there is on-road transportation. Those are going the wrong direction. We're seeing increased emissions from 2010 to 2015. Building, on the other hand, is going in the right direction. It's going down. The emissions are decreasing related to buildings, and that's thanks in no small part to the creation and the implementation of the Sonoma Clean Power Authority, where a lot of our energy or electricity that we're receiving is coming from cleaner sources. And then there's also this graph also has bits on solid waste and off-road transportation, but we can really see that the biggest buckets here are that on-road transportation and building energy use, and those are the areas that a lot of the focus needs to be on. How do we keep that decreasing, and policies that will come before the Planning Commission are directly related to that. I think about the VMT. I think about future codes to the all electric would definitely help the building energy use section as it relates to new construction. And then of course, as soon as that was approved, then the question becomes, what about the other 98% of those emissions in existing buildings? So those are things to be thinking about for the future. But to briefly go over these goals, the climate emergency framework discusses the need to develop a climate action plan, and there's a climate action and adaptation plan being developed as part of the general plan process. So that's great that there's one thing that's already underway in these goals. With the goals, with the purpose being to how do we eliminate the transportation emissions and the building sector emissions, because really, that's what needs to happen in the future. We need to meet those climate neutral, those carbon neutral goals. Those emissions need to be eliminated and offset to draw down the carbon that's already in the atmosphere. Their goals discuss zero waste and how we reduce our consumption-based emissions. The graph over there in the slide talks about direct emissions, so that's burning fossil fuels. But when we get products, when we, for lack of a better word, consume those products that we receive, there's energy embedded into it. There's resources embedded into the manufacture, the transportation, and ultimately the disposal of those products. So how do we reduce those emissions? How do we do things more locally? How do we reduce the amount of waste that we're producing in this process? So goals on that. And then also, how do we enhance the urban forest and adopt regenerative land practices? How do we develop partnerships and build healthy soils that help us draw down carbon? So adaptation and social resilience. So these goals have a lot to do with looking to the future, looking forward, anticipating the impacts of more frequent and severe climate risks. And that can include sea level rise, that can include more frequent wildfires that we've already been experiencing. So part of it is adapting to what's happening now, in addition to a more severe future. And how do we prepare? So not just looking to identify those, but how do we prepare and how do we become more resilient so that recovery can be quicker? It would involve using whole system thinking, designing for long-term community well-being and economic vitality. How do we make sure that the policies that are being put in place meet those goals? And it really involves valuing natural resources, not just from what can be extracted from the natural environment, which has been the way of thinking for a lot of human history, but instead respecting the interconnectedness of the land and its inhabitants, taking a natural systems-based approach, and kind of letting nature heal itself in a way, and not getting in the way of that to the extent that we can do that. Recognize also the mental toll of living in an emergency takes on people. It's stressful, it's difficult, and if these are, I mean, this is what we're dealing with right now, and if these occurrences become more frequent in the future, it's going to be really difficult to keep carrying on with that. So how do we build our kind of internal resilience as a community to move forward? So that's got to be part of the equation. And then also developing resilient infrastructure to speed that recovery. I mentioned, we have to plan, we have to identify, we have to plan, and then we need to be ready. And to the extent that we're ready, we're going to be recovering faster. And then finally, focusing on the overlap of the framework. And this is kind of especially important with the Planning Commission, is, these goals are really important, and a lot of these things relate to development. And so where we have adopted regulations in place that say one thing, and then there's goals of this framework that are maybe looking in a different direction, there really needs to be a robust discussion about how that conflict is resolved, and how we make sure that we're implementing the goals in this framework, while not, violating other laws that are conflicting with it at the same time. So that's going to be an ongoing discussion, I'm sure, with the Planning Commission. And finally, the last section here is community engagement. In these talks that I give to the other committees and commissions, I try to focus on specific points that are relevant. I felt like the whole discussion, all of these goals were relevant to the Planning Commission, so I kept all of them, and I didn't necessarily highlight any specific goals in it. But these 4 goals in the community engagement, I think, are relevant to all our committees and commissions, because to the extent that we are engaging our community, we're promoting that climate literacy, we're getting involvement, we're getting the community as part of the solution for these problems that are facing us. Those are really goals of all the committees and commissions, and that's something that you do well, is bringing those groups in. Like, let's have the biggest group we can have to tackle these really difficult problems. And so these goals shouldn't be news to you. They should be all things that seem pretty familiar with you and within your wheelhouse, because this is what you as commissions do best. You bring the community along. And so it's really going to be incumbent upon all of us to make that part of this process, as well as we talk about the framework. So with that, where can you learn more about this? We have a webpage, cityofpetaluma.org/climate-ready. It has the framework in its full glory there for you to view. It has all the goals that we presented here and a whole lot more background that is helpful. It talks about the vision. It talks about what the Climate Action Commission involved the community in the development of it. So I encourage all of you. It's not a super long read. I think it's about 43 pages, and there's a lot of images that help illustrate what the thinking was behind it in there. So I encourage everybody to take a read of it, and you can find it there on that website. In terms of tonight, we're here to answer questions you may have about the framework, but I really want to focus on the point that this is an initial conversation. This is by far not the last conversation we'll be having on this. It's really an introduction and really just an invitation to have a future conversation on this as you think about the framework more, and as more questions arise, and as maybe some more specific plans or developments or situations come up that you'd like to have a more of a dialogue on. It's an invitation to have those conversations, and we're we're happy as a staff to have those conversations and help you in your positions on the Planning Commission with that. So if you have any feedback on that, we're happy to hear that. And if there's thoughts on implementation of the action or collaboration with the Planning Commission and the Climate Action Commission, happy to facilitate that as well. So with that, I thank you for your time tonight, and thank you in advance for your questions. And would like to open it up. And if you would like to add anything to this, I think now would be a great time if you want to speak ahead of the questions about the context of the framework and the process that the ad hocs went through. But or if you want to save your comments for the Q&A, that's fine too. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you, Patrick. That was great. I'll hold my comments until we have some questions. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Baker, and thank you for a very, very thorough and comprehensive presentation, Mr. Carter. We all enjoyed that, and it's a lot to learn. Thank you, and thanks for all the hard work that went into it also. So we'll now move on to general public comment. General public comment is for items on this agenda item. So anybody that would like to comment on that, please raise their hand, and I will let our moderator, Mr. Roberts, take over from here.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. Just as during general public comment, I'll invite our attendees to raise their hands at the bottom of their screen, and I'll call on you in the order in which you've raised your hand. I see one hand raised, so I'll go ahead and share my timer for 3 minutes. Okay, and up first is Ben Peters. Ben Peters, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself, and I'll ask that you please state your name for the record.
Yeah, hi everyone, Ben Peters. Just wanted to follow up on some previous comments about the importance of the Climate Action Commission and the Planning Commission reviewing all technologies that have a climate impact. That includes backup generators, that includes fossil fuel vehicles. So this is something the Planning Commission can really help our city and our citizens understand, but something that's not really taking place currently. So that's something that I think we can all strive to do a slightly better job of, is understand how climate-friendly technologies can play a part in our city. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Up next is Susan Kirks. Susan, I've allowed you to speak. You'll need to unmute yourself, and I'll ask that you please state your name for the record.
Hi, Susan Kirks here. I appreciate being able to attend your meeting this evening. I attended all of the Climate Action Commission meetings and was able to participate representing 2 conservation organizations via the public. I was not asked to be part of an ad hoc committee, although of course it would have been nice to participate. And I particularly want to thank Chair Ann Baker, who's here this evening, and the 2 commissioners, Kylea Frederick and Ned Orett, who were very receptive to the input that I wanted to give in the area of conservation and climate action related to our natural resources. Specifically in the climate emergency ordinance, the reference to species extinction. And how I think that relates to your commission is when you receive proposals to review. In the future, I think the city of Petaluma will need a really stringent review, more than I have seen, of course, of biological resource reports. It's really, really important to understand that we have to be proactive in understanding habitat areas, where wildlife live and move, where birds migrate to and nest or reside. And in my experience, in about 21 years here in Petaluma, my experience actually is in living in our environment. And so that's how I approach reviewing your work when you have a development proposal come before you. Some of you may remember that I made some comments on the Hines downtown development, and I believe the chair at the time said there had been some interesting or unusual type comments, which I assume referred to mine, but it's really important that we include and really make an effort to understand that just because there's an open area of grass that hasn't been developed with a few trees, we really need to work on preserving trees. I'm glad to see the tree technical manual coming, but we also need to understand the habitat and the movement areas that exist, which are quite rich here in Petaluma, to be able to take local action to address the threat of species extinction. And again, how that relates to your commission's work is in the area of biological resources review. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Up next, we have Beverly Alexander. Beverly, I've allowed you to speak. I'll ask that you please state your name for the record.
Okay, I'm Beverly Alexander, and I am so glad that that there is this framework being developed. One thing I noticed, though, is a lot of the elements of the framework are about what human beings do. And what I think needs to be included is our natural environment, because it's a little bit like only looking at the Earth and not looking at the fact that we're in a solar system and the solar system is in the Milky Way. But we are alive here because of the natural environment, and yet we treat it as if it were a house, something that we put the furniture in. And if there's a bare spot in our house, you know, we can just stick another couch in there and it's no big deal. But it's actually it's what gives us life, both in terms of the beauty, which I think we really depend on more than we think about, and also just the whole question of climate change. We need those carbon sinks. We need those trees. We need those plants. We need the soil to be intact, you know, and not disturbed. We need the rain to be able to penetrate the soil and not run into the rivers. So I just want to encourage the everyone who's working on this to really look at it in a more holistic way, in a more inclusive way. You know, we talk about climate justice, but where is the climate justice when it comes to our native plants and animals? I think that they are very, very important, not just in a, what do you call it, sentimental manner, but as being really crucial to our survival. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Beverly. It appears that that is our last public comment for this item this evening. I'll pass it back to Chair Bauer.
Great. Thank you very much, Moderator Roberts. We'll now move on to commission questions on the presentation, and we'll start with Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you very much, Chair Bauer. And Patrick, I wanted to thank you for giving this presentation to us. This is just as lovely as it was when you presented for PBAC. And I really love the focus that you have with regards to this being about kind of starting a conversation and what that looks like. I have many questions that I tend to ask, some smaller, some longer, with a little bit of a preamble for the last one. But all of this is really focused around kind of wrapping my head around exactly that issue. First question I wanted to ask, and I don't know if this would be for you, Patrick, or one of the staff that are here, but how exactly will the climate adaptation plan work? Will it be kind of off in its own is it going to be kind of isolated in a way, stating where we have major areas we need to address with recommendations for how to do it, or is it going to be integrated within the whole updated general plan, with there being some kind of appendix to where those segments are?
I can start, and Heather, maybe you can fill in where I don't have all the answers. What I believe the intent of the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan is to really be that roadmap for what specific actions do we need to take to get to our 2030 goals. So it's not supposed to be a document that kind of sits on a shelf or something like that. It's supposed to be something that we're referring to constantly, and tracking our progress towards. There'll be, I believe, dashboards created to kind of show where we are in relation to our progress on those goals. So it's very much supposed to be a living document that we're referring to constantly to get to our goals.
I think that was well said, Patrick. I don't know, and I wish Christina was here. I don't know that we've decided exactly whether it's going, the exact form it's going to be in. I think it is not necessarily part of the same document as the general plan, because it is actually, even though the general plan is a working document and is guiding everything, I think of the climate action plan as almost being like a, getting down one step further into implementation and detail to be implemented.
Right, and related to that, will it, I guess in terms of the recommendations it'll make, because I'm just trying to think about concerns around a document like that having the teeth that it needs. Will it have any direct recommendations for our zoning, for IZO implementation, anything like that, either existing or to be proposed? And is that something other municipal, because I remember from, sorry, I did not mean to interrupt. I was just thinking from the discussion around the consultant being selected, I remember a big point was their expertise around this area. And I was just wondering for other municipalities, how do they link the climate action plan? Does it make those kind of connections, or really does it stay in that kind of guideline list with dashboards and we kind of figure out how to get there on our own?
I'm almost wishing, Olivia, are you here? She is here. And I'm going to use the wrong terminology with the climate action plan being certified, or I'm forgetting what the terminology is.
Qualified by the Air District. It's a qualified climate action plan.
I knew I didn't have the right terminology, but I knew there was a word. And in a lot of jurisdictions, it also is almost like a checklist that developments have to go through and have to do things to. So I think Santa Rosa is one example where they have a checklist of things and you have to do certain things in order to achieve a standard that's in keeping with the goals. So that's what I mean. I think of it even as going into a real specific action items, more specific than some of the general plan policies in it. And you are correct that the expertise and the qualifications of the Ramey team and what they have brought to the table was a big factor in the selection of that team.
And related to that, because I think the checklist sounds fantastic, is that something then when we're going through these projects, theoretically, if it takes that shape, just like we're looking at the general plan or we're looking at the IZO, is this going to be something that we then get to look at, and if we reject a project because it doesn't follow those boxes, we're safe to do so without it being kind of a gray area item? And I only bring that up because recently we've had a few projects where we're supposed to follow one thing, but it's not quite firm enough for us to go all the way with that requirement.
I do think I'm trying to think, and Olivia has worked a lot with the checklist in Santa Rosa in this as you integrate it into the CEQA documents. So when we're preparing CEQA documents in Santa Rosa, it's going through and confirming that the project is consistent with the climate action plan because it meets these items that is outlined in the climate action plan. That's why I'm kind of pulling Olivia in, just because she has real intimate knowledge with working with one that was developed by one of our neighbors.
If I could just add also, the Santa Rosa checklist does have both mandatory and voluntary measures. And so the mandatory ones are everyone and anyone must comply with those. And then there's a carve out built in. So if for some reason, and it can be justified, that you can't meet one of those mandatory, you must demonstrate a replacement or more than one. And that is something that is discretionary to consider if that is an adequate replacement.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
Related to this, what are under ideal conditions, what's the timeline for this being not drafted, but implemented? Or at least in a place where we're able to start making use of it as a reference document?
The climate action and adaptation plan. So it would be coming along concurrently with the general plan update.
So that's probably 4 to 5 years, or would it be more in line with the housing element?
Well, we still would like the housing element, the general plan update, and the climate action and adaptation plan all to be in line at the end of 2022. Recognizing that that's a statutory requirement of the housing element. And so the general plan, if it doesn't fall right in line, we have to do the housing element, and that might take a little bit longer. But I am really hoping it's not 4 or 5 years. I am hoping that if the general plan is a little bit behind the housing element for one reason or another, I'm hoping it's not that far behind the housing element.
Okay. And I honestly, by the way, just thought that the general plan would follow after. I wasn't meaning to make a judgment. That makes sense.
Commissioner Hooper, just 1 second, because I see Gina Benedetti-Pecknick has her hand raised, and she might have some clarification on something you asked or something that was said.
Thanks, Chair. Not really a clarification, but just a practical point to your question, Commissioner Hooper. You know, when can we start using it? You know, I have my public works engineering staff using it now. When we have enough direction with that document in place and where it's coming from that commission and from council goals and priorities, that we're already utilizing that as we develop our priorities and CIP projects and programs for all sorts of different climate initiatives that are either aligned with existing projects that needed a boost or that are really the genesis of new projects. And I directed my engineering staff, I don't know, 2-3 months ago, that when we put together our staff reports, we're not just identifying our alignment with council goals and priorities, we're reflecting under the climate section of those staff reports the consistency with the plan that you.
I think he was referring to the climate action and adaptation plan, Gina, not the climate emergency framework.
No, that's. Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I was referring to the framework. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was mostly focused on discretionary projects, just thinking about what we see before us. And as much as we know we'd like to go certain places, we have applicants who know what our rules allow.
Yeah,
so
correct. And that's one of the challenges we have is we have adopted the climate emergency framework to guide all of the decisions we're making, but we also have regulations on the book that the climate emergency framework doesn't supersede. So we're using the climate emergency framework to guide what policy, what regulation shifts we are looking at anytime we're making a change. We're trying to incorporate that. That's why our focus has been on things like all electric and the natural gas ban or the fossil fuel ban and those kind of things. So definitely trying to use the climate emergency framework whenever we can to guide our thinking, to guide our efforts. But you are right, we run into situations sometimes where the regulations that are adopted in our codes maybe haven't been updated yet in alignment with the climate emergency framework. And that's where we get into some difficult discussions, and that's when we try to have conversations with applicants to encourage them to do the right thing, even if we don't have the regulation in place.
And actually, I'm going to jump ahead in an order of questions, but that relates directly to one I already had down, which is, has the work been done to overlap where we've got, whether it's zoning map, IZO, any of kind of the interlinking text we have between that and then kind of our climate planning goals? Has the work been done to overlap where our hands are tied? Because I was just thinking in terms of the conversation we're having about what we can do. And one thing that comes to mind is getting these projects and wanting to push for things and not always knowing where that boundary is. And I was just wondering if that kind of overlap had been done so we'd have kind of a clear view of what we can do now versus later.
I don't think in a tidy map or summary, or we're working on it kind of in pieces because there's so many different ways, that it looks at. We're also trying to look at some of the recommended actions that the Climate Action Commission forwarded to the council as kind of like, hey, these are like our top priorities. Let's start working on these, while we're also working on the larger general plan, revisioning, really, getting our climate action and adaptation plan, looking really holistically at our floodplain and our riparian and a lot of those things. So I don't think we have it. I don't believe we have it in a form to kind of say, here's all the intersections. Interesting concept. And I'm like, I immediately start thinking about that. We've started looking at things like, where is the overlap with the floodplain and the housing opportunity sites and some of those things that look at a specific part of the climate emergency framework, but not more holistically with all of the places they intersect, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And by the way, just in terms of like a neat bow, I would take a horribly monstrous spreadsheet with far too many tabs. That would be just fine with me. But just thinking about that though, the reason why I also bring it up is because thinking about the last project we discussed, the East Washington Place, for example, that was mixed use, but also wasn't mixed use. There were questions about VMT that weren't quite clear for it because it's kind of before all of this in a lot of ways. Questions about housing and how we're able to increase density, not increase VMT, and then at the same time not acknowledge the fact that our current plan calls for a lot of retail and regional transit and regional vehicle movement in a way that doesn't make sense in 2021. And just thinking about how these things are coming up, I wanted to know, for this conversation going forward, is there a way where we can help in terms of prioritizing some of these changes now so we're not waiting just for GPAC to do it? Because I know from just the perspective of the projects I've seen, it's parking minimums, it's what mixed use actually looks like. It has to, the single family zoning issue keeps coming up again and again. We have different things we've come across that we know are problems for us that we'd like to do. And I'm just wondering if there's a prioritization we can help with, if there's outreach we can help with. I don't know if this is just a requirement of council priorities and public outreach then to staff or vice versa. Because I'm just thinking as we have future meetings, what can we be advocating in each project, in each report that really starts to get some of these priorities forward so that we don't have to wait 2, 3, maybe 4 years on some of this.
And I really want to assure you that we're not sitting on our hands while the climate action and adaptation plan is being developed as part of the general plan. And I feel like staff has been moving, and maybe we're not doing everything as quickly as everybody wants us to do, but I actually think there has been some amazing things that have happened with staff very recently, and since the adoption in the first 6 months of this year, that we're taking some of those priorities that came from the Climate Action Commission, came through council, and things like, moving to all evergreen, getting that set up for all city facilities, the gas station ban, the all electric code, and which actually went beyond just new construction and also went to significant remodels and additions on existing construction. I mean, there's been a lot of things. We're working on our parking study session to bring forward to talk about prioritizing things having to do with parking. We're trying to work on affordable housing. I mean, these are all things we're actively engaged in, and saying, no, we're not sitting around for 2 years. That was one of the reasons we had the housing workshop with the council, was to say, yes, we're going to be doing a housing element update and a general plan update, and there's a lot that's going to go into that. But what can we do in the short term? What can we be doing in the next 2 years to keep moving forward and making sure that we are prioritizing? And things like the single family zoning is, one of the things that came up, different ways to try to facilitate more affordable housing. So the other thing I would bring up is the council is going to be doing the prioritization discussion at their meeting on June 20. Somebody help me here.
28.
Thank you. June 28th. The council is going to be doing a prioritization exercise with a lot of these things, because I completely agree. We have more kind of ideas and energy than there is just the ability to kind of, package it up and get it done and do the CEQA analysis and do all the pieces that go into place with it. So that's a great place. That will be a great discussion with the community, with the council, with staff on, okay, so what are our, top priorities? What are the things we're going, as quickly as possible? And what are the things that once we're done with that, then we'll start these things. So that's another way I think that input both from the community and from members of the commission could be part of that discussion.
If I could just jump in really quick, I just wanted to underline what Heather said about recognizing that we are in an emergency and there's need to take immediate action, but also to do things comprehensively and not do things in a silo that we're going to have to fix later. So I think that the adoption of the framework with the promise of a climate action and adaptation plan kind of bridges that balance really well, because it gives justification for taking those early actions that need to happen sooner than later. I mean, ideally it'd be all of it, but if everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. So we really need to focus on what discrete actions can we take right away and start moving that needle on climate change. And so that's the framework, and it's also those 15 priority actions that the Climate Action Commission submitted to the council. And we've made progress on a lot of those goals. Some of them were like, initial, adopt, 2030 as the goal. And it's like, okay, check that box. But then the rest of it talks about going down further. So we've made a lot of that initial quick progress, but there's still work to be done on fitting all those implementation tasks into our
and
work.
We're all talking about it, like Gina brought up, like Patrick brought up, that Olivia, we're all talking about it constantly. Like everything that is happening, with staff, it's all through that lens of, well, how does this sync up? How are we looking at, or how should we look at this differently? How should, we thought we were on this path, but should we, veer this way or think of it through this lens? So.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, I think the pace that you have all moved at with regards to recent policy changes have been fantastic, especially in recent years. My question was more because to the points you each raised, there are so many things happening, and I know what it's like when you have competing demands and limited resources, which the city does have limited resources. And so I was just asking more from a perspective of, if there are things we know that are kind of next steps that aren't short term, but are places we've wanted to move towards that need a little bit more help, like how we as a commission can be helpful to you, because there's already so much on your plate. And I was just wondering about that in terms of outreach or advocacy, or just in being clear about the issues we're having with regards to some of the projects that we have to approve and the ways we have to approve them. And that leads to, and we've ended up covering a whole lot of my questions, so thank you very much. That leads to my final question, which is really, with all of this in mind, I appreciate that this is going to be a conversation. But I remember when we did the general plan process starting and said this was going to be a conversation and there'd be multiple ways to provide input, it quickly felt like there was a starting point, and then that kind of moved on, which is fine. In this case, though, I don't want to see that go where we're just wondering when there's going to be another meeting or another potential workshop of us to be able to discuss this. So I guess my question is, is there a plan structure for how this conversation is going to work, especially looking at the general plan, looking at the climate plan framework and seeing the whole systems thinking approach that came up several times? Is there a structure for not just planning, but the other commissions that you've presented to be able to help in this process going forward, that we can kind of follow, that we can work towards, that allows each of us to be proactive for you?
That's a great question. So we are working at developing kind of a schedule, subject to change, obviously, because you always think it's going to go this way, and then you veer off, or you circle back, or different things come up, and you need to remain flexible and fluid. We have also talked about making sure that all the liaisons for the different boards and the CCBs, the committees, commissions, and boards, that regular updates are being fed to the liaisons to then give updates to the members, so we can just kind of keep everybody, up to date and knowing what's next and when there will be opportunities. And I think also, making sure we touch base enough, not just when there's a formal feedback loop, but giving you enough information, because all of you are ambassadors out in the community too, and keeping people engaged, or saying, hey, what's coming up? There's going to be a pop-up workshop here, or, next month there's a survey coming out, or, just being another way to get that information out into the community. So stay tuned, but yes, that's not missing or gone. And then the commission is a kind of a regular feedback loop in the general plan process, like so many things that come, and before it gets to the council, we loop in the planning commission. So you as a group too will be part of that feedback loop often.
And just to add to that, Heather, the planning commission it has a different statutory authority than other commissions, like the Climate Action Commission. So there's things that are kind of within the Planning Commission's purview that aren't within the Climate Action Commission. But that's not to say that there couldn't be joint meetings if there was a benefit to kind of having that discussion. That's kind of like, here we're thinking about this from a planning perspective, but also, even though the Climate Action Commissioners don't have like a vote in a project or something like that, if there was a joint meeting where you could kind of discuss the process, that might be a good overlap in the future, and that's possible to have joint meetings to kind of bring in that additional perspective, if that's something that both groups are interested in.
Oh, that would be. I'll just speak as myself. That would be phenomenal, I would think, especially from on one hand, just thinking about what are the short-term things we can do within our own restrictions that the Climate Action Commission might want to see that we could actually operationalize, and the feedback and comments we're giving, but then also to be able to like take a deeper look at our own rules together with them to see where there are ways that we can be collaborating. That, I think that would be incredibly beneficial, but that's just me. And thank you very much, Heather and Patrick and Gina and everybody, for your patience with this.
Thank you, Commissioner Hooper. I see that Councilmember Fisher has her hand up, but I also see that Ann Baker has her hand up, and I'm wondering, Ann, do you have something to add to Commissioner Hooper's question, or?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to add that I think one of the things that we all need to recognize is that the Climate Action Commission is a new commission, for the city, and we've only been working together maybe 15 months or so. And so I think there are some of these relationships aren't formalized, like how do we relate as commissions? How do we share information? How do we get on the same team? And I think a lot of what the Climate Action Commission is working on now is how do we make these transitions faster? How do we get to building decarbonization faster? How do we get to transportation decarbonization faster? And so there's some processes like the general plan update that take some time, and you can't entirely rush them. But then there's other processes like tactical urbanism, for example, or making streets safer or more accessible for biking, and that we've seen during the pandemic that actually can happen on a much faster timeline. And so I think that's one of the things that's challenging in this effort to move faster is how do we all get on the same page? How do we all start working together as a team? Because knowing that we're in a 9-year window to meet a really intense objective, it really is incumbent upon us to learn how to work together as a team and to kind of communicate effectively in these new challenges. So I think a lot of your questions are fantastic. I want to applaud you for asking them. And I do think, there's some things in your reviews where the idea is to take to make the building electrified, but also to have the building need to use less energy. So multifamily businesses or passive solar, passive heating, passive shade. There's, and the same thing with vehicles. Like we want to get to electrification of vehicles, but we also want to need less vehicles. So actually getting to less vehicle use is something that we should be prioritizing as much as electrifying. So anyway, there's just wanted to share some of those ideas, and thank you so much for bringing up those questions.
Thank you, Ann. Okay, we'll now move on to Councilmember Fisher.
Well, I actually didn't have a question, but I have a few comments, and then I wanted to turn it back over to Ann Baker, because I think what's missing from tonight's presentation is really what the vision of the Climate Action Commission is with this framework. We are here, we want to get here. How are we going to get there? And I think that's the question that we're all grappling with, staff and the community, and all of us are saying, okay, well, we have this audacious goal. What are the steps that we need to take to get there? And I want to really appreciate just my experience with staff sort of turning on a dime with this in the last 6 months. I mean, I've seen an amazing difference just in the reports and the thinking, and so it gives me great hope that we actually can get there. And so, and to Mr. Hooper's point, one of the things that I've found that's really helpful is just start talking about these things. We weren't talking about climate 2 years ago. We started talking about it 2 years ago in this town, right? It wasn't even a conversation. So let's start talking about waste. Let's start talking about what our consumption is. Let's start talking about where our food comes from. And if we're having these conversations, and if we're really grappling with these issues ourselves, I think and we're having these conversations with others and they're having that conversation, then we're all sort of in this together and working on how we get to where we need to go. And with that, Anne, if you don't mind, if you could just sort of tell us what that future is that we will see when we get there.
Well, I mean, I think the commission made a very intentional decision early on to think about the 4 topics that Patrick introduced, you know, and we made it our priority to look at an equitable and just transition, and to think about adaptation equally with mitigation, meaning, you know, reduction of our use of carbon, and understanding that the kind of way we were going to get there was through engagement and outreach with our community, because there's a certain number of things that the city can do as an entity, like the Evergreen Power, or lots of decisions in the general plan process. And then there's a lot of things that the community needs to do as well. You know, to truly meet our goals as a community, that means that everyone needs to participate, or a lot of people need to participate. And so we're really actively thinking about how we inspire and engage and encourage and communicate around, you know, how do we do this together? And one of the things that was really, I guess, noteworthy that came out in one of our community meetings last year when we did a presentation, we got a lot of feedback from community members. I think we got over 1,000 comments on a survey. The biggest thing that folks in the community supported was safe, walkable, bikeable streets. And I think we could add into that, you know, what we've heard a lot since. We heard a little bit in the beginning of this meeting in the public comment is nature-based solutions. And so I think there's this kind of general sense coalescing that our built environment is really reflecting this kind of 60s sensibility of, you know, here's the street and here's the house and the nature's out there, you know, and that we don't need to do designs that address stormwater and street trees and shading and air quality and pollution, but actually that's what we need to be doing. So we're really looking at trying to develop kind of a holistic livable environment. So we want to reduce our pollutants and our chemicals in our environment because we've suppressed nature so much. We can't afford to suppress nature so much in our city anymore, or take this city out of the ecosystem, the larger ecosystem of which it once was an integral part. You know, we have to reimagine, like, what was the role of the Petaluma wetlands, riparian area, meadows in this larger ecosystem? What was here, you know, and what can we then replace? Because not only do we need to, you know, we need to not be spewing more carbon and pollution into the air, we actually have to restore our Earth's ability to be healthy and thrive, you know? And so it's really kind of those 2 things together that we're trying to do is kind of like, okay, we need to dial down our 20th century technology that actually wasn't good for the earth and not good for public health either. And then we also need to reimagine our built environment so that it's, you know, green and livable and lively and a wonderful place to be, you know? So we try and talk about this transition in both ways, because, you know, you can frame it as you have to give up all these things, you know, you have to give up your gas stove, you know, et cetera, but there's really so much to be gained in terms of greater public health, more livable, walkable, more community-oriented, connected spaces. And I think when we imagine those things, and then we look in our everyday lives and we look at the decisions we're making in city government, how do we bring those things into being as fast as possible? Then you start pushing on decisions that you're making about repaving streets. Like, oh, do we really want to just repave them exactly as there are? Can we get a gain here? Can we get a gain over there? And that's the thing about everybody working together as a team. Like, we need to get all the gains we can as fast as we can. And so the commission's really working hard to try and to bring that momentum into these different spaces. And that's why we're participating in these conversations, is to try and bring the excitement and the drive for people to really, you know, just really trying to push forward. And I think the city staff's really doing that really great. And we're learning as we go, you know. But I think the main thing is to hold a vision of really a more green and more livable community that's going to be a more beautiful community for everyone.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne. Are there any other commissioner questions right now? Okay, well, I just have one, and that was feeding off of something that Commissioner Hooper said regarding the review of the eventual review of discretionary projects and having the voluntary versus like mandatory mitigation measures. And I was wondering how that will come up. Is that something we will review at some point, or will that go directly to is that going to go to the Climate Action Commission and then to City Council, or would it come through us first, or how does anybody foresee that happening?
With the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan?
Mm-hmm.
So the Climate Action Commission is going to play a really close role in the development of that. And I believe that it then would circle through the Planning Commission before it goes to the City Council. I don't have it right in front of me to kind of how every touch point that we're kind of been talking about, but because we just talked about that at the Climate Action Commission, I thought there was multiple touch points with the Climate Action Commission, but there will definitely be a touch point with the Planning Commission on that before it goes to Council as well.
Okay. And would that be something in there? There would be sort of like the CEQA checklist, like voluntary and mandatory measures that we would use for project review, or would it not be that overt?
Well, I mean, I don't want to say this is exactly how we're going to do it, but that is one example that other jurisdictions have done, is they have a checklist of items that then is used in their environmental review of a specific project. So like Olivia was talking about, when you're doing a CEQA document for a project in Santa Rosa, you're looking at these are the minimum mandatory things that you have to incorporate into your project. Here's recommended options. So that's, I just don't want to commit to it will be in exactly this form, because we haven't gotten there yet. And so maybe that form has evolved, and maybe the proposal will be something different that's an evolved form from what Santa Rosa did. I'm just using one type of example of how a climate action plan kind of got down into the nitty-gritty and was incorporated into every discretionary review project that goes through under that. So that's one option. I just don't want to commit to an exact form because we haven't gotten there yet, and I want to leave the process, to unfold and to be using the very best and latest and greatest in whatever we end up developing.
Do you think, though, that this document will be have the same teeth, say, that CEQA has, or do you think it would be more used as guidance?
Well, Olivia, please jump in. But my understanding is the way that is used is it's used in the CEQA review.
Okay.
So it's incorporated, that checklist is used in the CEQA review. So it's not replacing CEQA or on top of CEQA, it's kind of incorporated into CEQA documents.
Yeah, one of the elements for achieving that qualification under the Air District to be a qualified climate action plan is that you must have a CEQA document that's done and conducted for the climate action plan, adaptation plan itself. And you must have some kind of implementing document. So that's where the checklist type example comes into play.
Perfect. Okay. I like that. That is good news that it's going to be mandated by another agency. So, as well as ourselves. Thank you.
I'll just add to that, to the extent that that having these issues hard-coded into the CEQA checklist, to the extent that that's something that the commission wants, that's good feedback for Ramey and Associates to know when they're developing the climate action and adaptation plan. So, this isn't agendized for that discussion right now, but in the future, if that's something, in the absence of knowing what the alternatives are, because that discussion's not really been had, but if that during the discussion, you kind of keep coming back to this being something that would be really useful to the Planning Commission. That's great feedback to have for Ramey in the development of the CAP.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. I speak for myself, but when we have something written that we could point to when we're reviewing project is pretty critical and very important, and yeah, goes a long way in us being able to put proper, make sure that when we approve or comment on projects that we are protecting natural resources while we do so. So yeah, that is great as far as I'm concerned. But I want to allow now other commissioners to give their feedback. I know there were a lot of questions, but if anybody wants to give general feedback, please raise your hand. Okay, I see Commissioner Ryder.
Yeah, actually, more than anything, I just want to express my appreciation to staff and the Climate Commission for this document. First of all, it is beautiful and it's easy to read and understand. And so having read a lot of these over the years, this one definitely sets the bar pretty high for others. So I don't have any additional comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Ryder. Yes, and I do want to applaud staff on a very, very job well done. So thank you for your thoroughness in doing this. And I see we have some other ones. Council Member Fisher.
Well, I just wanted to express my gratitude to Ann Baker and her leadership in all this, and all the work that she's done, along with her fellow commissioners. But she really has taken the lead, and I think done a wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso.
Thank you, Chair Bauer, and thanks for staff for the really important presentation tonight. I just had a few quick comments. I just wanted to echo the importance of community readiness that was called out in the plan. I think that's so important as climate change unfortunately changes our weather for the negative, with wildfire season's already started here in Sonoma County and in Petaluma. So I think calling that out was really important, along with being a resilient community. So I just want to thank the staff and the commission for calling that out, and I think we really need to hammer that home. The other kind of brief comment I just wanted to make on the community engagement piece is really just, that we come up with a lot here is just reaching folks that aren't normally involved in this type of process. So either they don't speak English as their primary language, or they live on the east side of town, right? Things like that. So I think we just really need to think about that strategically as we unveil this and strengthen it. And I think it's really exciting that the community conversations are happening, and I appreciate folks coming tonight. I think this was raised earlier, but maybe we have regular joint meetings with the Climate Commission, as the Planning Commission. Maybe it's an annual basis, or for particular study sessions. I think that would be really helpful. And just so that we can learn from them, maybe they can learn from us, but I think it would be a nice thing for the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Vice Chair Alonso, and excellent comments. And I 100% agree with you that I think collaboration and meeting together with them would be great. It's a very, very good idea. I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, I see Commissioner Marzo.
Thank you very much, Chair Bauer. Just to quickly piggyback on my fellow commissioners, I want to thank the commission and the staff for their hard work. I've had the pleasure of been a part of Mr. Carter's presentation before for the Tree Advisory Committee. Again, I want to thank you. It's obviously a priority for our city. And I'm only going to add one comment to piggyback off of Commissioner Alonso's comment of community readiness, climate justice, and as much as we're going to move forward on mitigating a lot of what we can control, the reality still exists. And in our own town, we have an amazing resource in the fairgrounds that serve as an evacuation center to help those communities that need that support, and that also those communities of animals that need our support. And I just want to remind everyone of the amazing resource that the fairgrounds have been for not only the residents of Petaluma, but for residents of Sonoma County. And I hope our leaders continue to utilize that space in as much as they can for to help alleviate and mitigate the effects that are going to continue, unfortunately, to happen in our area. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Marzo. Are there any other comments at this point? I don't see any, so we'll say thank you very much to everybody that came to present to us and answer all of our questions and taking the time out of your evenings to see us through there and to kick off this very great plan that is going to help our community a lot in our environment. So thank you very much for all your hard work. I appreciate it. And we'll go ahead and close this agenda item. And we'll move on to the next one, which is the local hazard mitigation plan. And we'll be having the presentation by our associate planner, Asher Cohen, for this.
Hi, good
Asher,
evening,
are you
Chair. I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, good evening, Chair and Commission. My name is Asher Cohen. I'm associate planner here, and this is my first time presenting to the Planning Commission. So thank you very much for having me tonight. I'm going to discuss the resolution in front of you. It's a resolution recommending that City Council approve a general plan amendment that will adopt by reference the city's the city's recently adopted local hazard mitigation plan. This is a plan that was adopted by council in late last year. And what it does is it kind of gives a profile of the city and then analyzes risks and vulnerabilities in the city and then presents mitigation projects that basically fit the hazards to the city's conditions. The reason we're having this come in front of you tonight is the general plan amendment allows the city to become eligible for additional funding if it is adopted by council. So there's a state law that basically once the local hazard mitigation plan is adopted into the general plan, that jurisdiction is eligible for additional funding. Just to get a little bit of background on the local hazard mitigation plan, it was developed over a nearly 2-year period over the past couple of years before being adopted in November. And it's a fairly meaty document. It begins with this mitigation action summary table, which discusses the various mitigation measures of the plan. And then it goes through, there's the community profile and the risk assessment that I discussed, and the mitigation strategies, which is a series of goals, 5 goals that are then connect these mitigation strategies to the risk assessment that it sees. And it's important to know it's not a static document. There's plan implementation and plan maintenance that's inherent in the plan, and that will be allowing the plan to look at and respond to hazards as they develop and mitigate any issues that might come up. The risk assessment, it looks at 11 hazard categories, some of which might be more intuitive, drought, earthquakes, sea level rise. Others may be less so, hazardous material releases, cyber threat, things that can have a deleterious effect on city infrastructure may not be thought of in the same way. Sea level rise are also part of this plan in order to make it a coherent and, as I said, a really meaty document that addresses the hazards that the city might face. The hazard mitigation strategies, as I said, there's 5 goals. I'll give you a moment to read them. And there are 34 mitigation actions that basically they feed into these 5 goals, and they fit into the hazards that I showed on the previous page. And these can all be seen in that mitigation table that's at the beginning of the plan. Okay, hopefully that was enough time to read through this. And then just to reiterate, it's not a static document. There are 2 principal early milestones: the adoption of the plan, which as the council did last November, and then there's the adoption of the plan into the general plan, which is what we're discussing tonight. Those are the milestones that really get the plan moving, and then the plan is implemented through the Public Works Department, that it integrates actions throughout the lifespan of the plan. Part of the regulations of what a hazard mitigation plan does and must do, it's revised every 5 years. So in 2025, the plan will be revised to look at new hazards, developing hazards, and just, as I said, to make sure it's up to date and responding to the most current information that the state, county, and city have. So this is going to be an amendment to the existing General Plan 2025. It was adopted, I think that's 13 years ago, and something interesting, kind of unique for this General Plan amendment is that it actually implements a policy in the plan. The policy you see in the black square on the right side of the screen. So there's a policy to adopt and maintain a hazard mitigation plan. At the time of adoption in 2008, Petaluma was part of a regional hazard mitigation plan, and now it has its own local plan that has been adopted. And this General Plan amendment, if it's fed through, if it goes through the system, then it will be able to implement this policy. The amendment that we're looking at tonight, it's 3 sentences. They're on the bottom half of this screen. Again, I'll give you a minute to read that. It's adds this language to the health and safety element. There's no deletions, there's no modified policies. This is basically this is what's needed to adopt the local hazard mitigation plan by reference and make the city eligible for this additional state funding that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. And I know the city's ongoing the general plan update, and I just want to explain how the general plan amendment we're talking about tonight relates to that process that is also ongoing. So the amendment, as I said, is to the current general plan, and it basically makes it so the city's covered and it's eligible for this funding through the time that the current general plan is the one that's active for the city. And when the new general plan update comes up for adoption, it will incorporate this language that makes the city eligible for additional funding. And it will basically, the language we're talking about tonight, if it's recommended, if it's adopted by council, if you recommend council adopt it, then it will be incorporated into this future general plan. So the idea is there'll be a smooth transition as the new general plan is adopted. And that is what we're discussing tonight. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I know that Gina Petnick is here from Public Works, and she was integral to the creation and the adoption of this plan, so she would be happy to answer questions as well. And yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Asha. That was an excellent presentation. Well, now before we go on to commissioner questions, we'll first do public comment on this agenda item. So if anybody wants to speak on this agenda item in particular, please raise your hand and we will let our moderator, Mr. Roberts, take it over from here.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. Just as our last item for our attendees joining us tonight, if you wish to participate in public comment on this item, simply raise your hand as you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I don't see any hands raised at this time, so just providing a few more moments. And I don't see any hands raised, so I'll pass it back to Chair Bauer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Roberts. And I think we have one more agenda item on the agenda, the VMT. I think you may have, did I hear you say that was our last agenda item? I'm not sure. I just wanted to clarify that there is another one coming up. Okay, so thank you very much. We'll close that public comment. And we could now move on to commissioner and liaison questions. And we'll start with Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you. It's not so much about what we're voting on tonight, but really a question about the 34 mitigation actions and sort of what's staff's thinking in terms of sort of keeping up with those or keeping track of those or actually implementing them. I don't know if Gina wants to take that or Heather.
Sure, I can take a stab at that, Councilmember Fisher. So I will say that some of those mitigations are already underway, and those that aren't are working their way into our short and, depending on which ones they are, and long-term planning. Not all of them. Again, it's the beauty of having these prioritized as part of the mitigation plan is extremely helpful and gives us some breathing room and opportunity to really address what we consider to be the highest risk issues. There's and it was in fact probably one of the most difficult components of developing this plan, between community input and staff input and consultant input through this process, was identifying those priorities. And there's a great page. It's in section 4.12, and it's titled Overall Hazard Significance Summary, and it explains how we basically defined the geographic extent and the probability of occurrences, the magnitude, severity, and overall significance, which really addresses the potential impact and what we saw as being low, medium, and high potential impact. So that table is huge for us as we process the options for addressing those mitigations.
Awesome, thank you. And then a second question is, keep getting questions from the community about our flood maps, and I guess I don't really understand the issue. And I know, Gina, you said at a previous meeting that we were in process of updating those maps, or are we still using FEMA maps? Or could you just give me a quick synopsis to take care of the questions coming from the community?
Of course, I'll try. It's a great question, and there is a lot of confusion and swirling comments about our flood maps and confidence in those. So, and to the extent that maybe I contributed to some of that lack of confidence, I have some misgiving. But it is safe to say that the modeling program that was used to develop the current maps that FEMA approved, that we use in our planning, that modeling is growing outdated. And there is new software. It's being adopted by FEMA. It's being currently used for new modeling at Sonoma Water. So Sonoma County Water Agency is utilizing this new software. It's called HEC-RAS-2. And don't ask me what that acronym stands for. I have to look that one up. I forget. But it's HEC-RAS and then the number 2, HEC-RAS-2. It is a 2/3-dimensional program that does a much better job at modeling what happens to water when it comes up to the bank of a channel. Our existing model, called which is based on a software program called XP-SWIM, oddly models the flow of water through a channel in the bank, and when it reaches the top of the bank, instead of modeling the water flow out through the topography, it models a vertical channel straight up. And then the modelers and the engineers have to then interpolate and spread that water out. So it's not as accurate, we feel, and that is a pretty general consensus in the engineering community. So so to back up a second now, so that's the modeling. The FEMA maps, the actual official FEMA maps that we are required to use, in our planning work and in our engineering work, those maps are based on these models. And yes, it's true that we are starting the new modeling effort to update our flood models. It's about a 1-year effort to do that. And after that, then we can start our application with FEMA for remapping the town based on the new modeling. And that can be another year to 2 years working through the FEMA process. As I understand it, I haven't done it before, but this is what I'm learning from my colleagues. So it's a bit of a process, as everything is in planning, but we are definitely moving in the right direction. Does that clarify?
Yeah, it does. It just, the question comes up then, if the modeling we're using, we don't think is accurate, and we're not going to get to where we need to be until 2 years from now, what are we doing in this meanwhile? Or are we doing anything?
It varies. There's been at least one development project that has come before this commission where we felt that, where the client, the applicant felt that the modeling should be revisited, and actually paid the city's consultant who does our flood modeling to do some special modeling on Adobe Creek. This is for the Casa Grande DRG project. And that was, and so they provided a comparison and analysis looking at the current flood maps based on XP SWIM and the updated modeling based on HEC-RAS-2, and we presented both in that case. So in that case, the applicant was very proactive and saw an opportunity to gain a better understanding of what they thought, and I agree is probably a more accurate understanding of how the floodwaters would move in that area. So I think, you know, at this point, that's what we have. In 6 months' time, approximately, we should have our preliminary flood model. It won't be calibrated yet, and I can explain what that means, but it is a really critical process in developing these flood models, where the initial model is very, it's numbers based and data based on topography. And it's a very complex assessment that's done basically on the computer. The calibration is done by taking real life actual floods that we've seen, and we know what the depths were, we know where they occurred, and using that to calibrate the model to make sure that they're aligning. That will take another several months. And that will give us very good mapping that we can reference, but we won't be able to, and I'm not quite sure, Olivia, if she's on, might be able to help me, until we have the maps, until we have the remapping process through FEMA. I'm not sure to the extent we can completely rely on the new mapping. We have it as an understanding, and it gives us a much better picture of what we can anticipate for planning purposes, but it won't quite be remapped through the formal FEMA process.
Great. Thank you very much for that.
Great. Thank you very much, Gina. Let's see. We'll move on to Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. And Gina, recognizing that this document can be critically important when we start to deal with disasters later on, I just want to make sure I had a firm handle on the real value of this document for the city. In functional terms, what we're really looking for is the FEMA approval so that in case the worst should happen, we will be eligible for the funding we'll need to help us through a large wildfire drought, or not drought, flood, or some other large declaration, correct?
There are already projects that we want to seek funding from FEMA to accomplish that are in this plan, that are also reflected in other plans that the city has, and we aren't eligible for the FEMA fund. We weren't eligible for any FEMA funding for those until the council approval. And at that, it was only 75%. So with this next action and the integration into the general plan, we would be able to apply for 100% funding for mitigation projects. It's actually really very important to to us at the city and to Public Works in particular, given the projects that we'd like to approach.
That's
I just
fantastic.
want to piggyback off of what Ms. Pagnick just said. Sorry, Commissioner Hooper, but FEMA approved this plan. I didn't mention it in the presentation. FEMA approved the plan soon after the council adopted it. Just want to make sure that's in the record as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cohn. And no, that's fantastic to know that this is being used for prevention purposes. I very much appreciate that update. The other question I wanted to ask, and I'm sure it's been explained a few times, but I just wanted to get a handle on it. I saw on the timeline that this had been reviewed by committees and commissions prior to going to council, then it went to council for approval, and now it's back here. Is there a reason it's in this order? Is it mostly that with council approval, FEMA can approve it, and then to Mr. Cohn's point, with our ability to add it into the general plan, it then gets the 100% match? Did it have to be structured that way, or was it kind of an accident that you're able to work around?
I won't speak for the planning department, but I think it was to our benefit to structure it that way because it gave us early access to funding, some access, and so I don't think it was accidental. But Heather, if you had any other thoughts on that.
I'm not sure how clear it was initially when the hazard mitigation plan was going through review and adoption that we needed a general plan amendment to adopt it by reference. And then when you look at the process for a general plan amendment, it has to come through the Planning Commission for recommendation before the council can act. So I'm not sure. I wasn't intimately involved in the local hazard mitigation plan process, so I'm not sure if kind of was a follow-up step to do the general plan amendment for funding eligibility or not. But that's why we're here now, is because in order to do a general plan amendment, the Planning Commission needs to make a recommendation to the City Council per the required process for that.
Thank you for that clarity. And then one question I had, tonight we're voting just on putting that line into, or those 3 lines into the general plan, making this kind of actualizing this document fully as a connecting kind of appendix for the general plan. There's really no area for us to be able to modify or have comments on at this point, is there? Is this just mostly for approving that language? Because if the council's already approved and FEMA's already approved, I just wanted to make sure that there wasn't more we could do regardless of what we might spot in the plan.
I think that's correct at this point. That I mean, if there's feedback, if I don't know, Gina, can you remind me, or Asher, when the next kind of update or relook was? Didn't you say there's a built-in
5-year?
5-year, so 2025. You know, so that would be the next time it's kind of cycling through for an update. But I would say, happy to take your feedback, happy to pass that on to the council, but the local hazard mitigation plan itself is already adopted, already sent to FEMA and approved through FEMA, and this is kind of a housekeeping, if you will, to add that language into the general plan in order to make us have that eligibility for funding.
Fair enough.
Heather, excuse me, and Commissioner Hooper, I see that Diane Ramirez is in attendance. Eric, if you could pull her up as a panelist, she may have some additional comments, either toward that or toward some other technical questions. Diane is our project manager for the LHMP and worked tirelessly on this project for the better part of a year, and has a lot of intimate knowledge of the contents of that 333-page document. So technical questions are going to be right up her alley.
Great, thank you. The only question I had after this, well, two parts. One, and given that some time has passed since this was put together, and we're looking at another fire season, we're looking at increased drought for a prolonged period of time. Just wanted to know, were there mitigations in this plan or strategies in this plan where, regardless of achieving the overall purpose, especially the funding purpose, which I sincerely understand, that at this stage you're a little, not necessarily concerned with, but are seeing will need to be beefed up in the future?
So you're asking if we feel the mitigations are still adequate?
I guess the point I'm trying to get to is, I assume they are adequate for the baseline of the purpose this document serves, especially with regards to the FEMA funding for grant programs. But I'm just wondering, in terms of some of these mitigations, if there aren't things that, given current conditions, might need to be improved sooner than the next cycle for an update on. That's all.
So maybe a priority adjustment you're asking. For instance, there are drought mitigations in here,
right,
and we're working on those. And are they elevated when we're facing, a 1 year extreme situation with drought and perhaps longer? And the answer is yeah. Staff is responding as quickly as we can. We've just turned around a project in 2 weeks to install 3 new hydrants to our purple pipe on the east side to help water haulers and provide some more access. It's purple pipe, so it's not for ag use, but it's definitely for other haulers and contractor use. And we are fast tracking some of our other water projects, and then working with county on yet more. So, it is absolutely a great concern to us. And yes, we're responding quickly. And we're not going to go to the hazard mitigation plan and look at it and say, oh, that was a medium priority. We won't do that.
I would also say the general plan update is another, loop on that. When we're updating the general plan and looking at our, safety element and looking at this local hazard mitigation plan, there might be recommendations through that process to modify, change, update on a more, a faster schedule, or that's another kind of that process is starting so soon after the adoption of this, that I think that's another great feedback loop for modifications to this plan as needed.
Excellent, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Commissioner Hooper. And I have a quick question, and that's just out of curiosity, as I know it's not part of the specifics of the local hazard mitigation plan, but I'm just wondering where the pandemic readiness and management comes into play. It is a kind of a man-made disaster, and our city does need to be prepared for it. Is that presented in another plan, or where do we plan for that?
It's here. It's in there.
Oh, it is in there.
Oh, it's in there. Yep, we got it.
Okay.
Epidemic, pandemic, vector-borne disease.
Great. I didn't see that part.
We got you covered.
Had to ask. Great.
No, and it wasn't in there initially. It was we had started the process, and then COVID hit, and like, we need another category.
Perfect.
So,
great.
Yeah.
Well, good work. Thank you for taking care of us. Okay, well, I see Vice Chair Alonso has his hand up.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'd like to make a motion to approve the resolution in attachment A for the agenda item tonight.
Great, thank you, Vice Chair. Is there a second?
If we're done with comments, I second that motion.
If we're done with comments, if I don't see any others quickly, then we'll be done with comments. And I hear first and a second, and we'll have to take a roll call. Ms. Ellis, would you like to take roll call?
Bauer?
Yes.
Alonso,
Yes.
Hooper,
Yes.
Marzo,
Yes.
Potter, absent, Ryder,
Yes.
Fisher.
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll close this agenda item. And before we move on to the next agenda item, raise your hand if anybody wants a 5-minute break. I see some hands raised. Okay, then let's reconvene here at 9 p.m. See you then. Welcome back, everybody. I think we're waiting on Commissioner Hooper. Are we live at this time? Okay, we'll just wait for Commissioner Hooper to join us and then we'll get started. Hi, there you are. There you are, Commissioner Hooper. Welcome. And we'll be able to start now our last item on the agenda, which is the vehicle miles traveled implementation guidelines. And that is going to be presented to us by our principal environmental planner, Olivia Irvin. Please take it over, Olivia.
Thank you. Yes, good evening. The item before you for consideration is the draft vehicle miles traveled implementation guidelines. This document establishes the city's framework for evaluating transportation impacts for discretionary projects under the California Environmental Quality Act. Clicking to my next slide. Here's an overview of the staff presentation that you'll receive, which is a overview of the detail provided in the written staff report. We're going to provide a refresher on the VMT regulation that was established through Senate Bill 743, a summary of the steps that the city has taken to come into compliance with that regulation, a discussion on the key elements of the city's draft VMT, Vehicle Miles Traveled Implementation Guidelines, which will be delivered by Matt Goyne with Farren Pierce. And we'll wrap up by touching on environmental review, the public noticing and opportunities for public comment, and staff's recommendation this evening. So Senate Bill 743 initiated a series of actions that resulted in an update to the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, and that changed the metric that is used to evaluate transportation impacts. So the state has mandated that lead agencies can no longer use level of service, which was the former metric, to evaluate transportation under CEQA, and instead must rely on a vehicle miles traveled metric. The VMT metric promotes active transportation, it aligns state greenhouse goals with reduction targets, it encourages infill development, and it discourages urban sprawl. As a result of the SB 743 guidelines, the CEQA guidelines themselves were augmented to provide guidance on determining transportation impacts and establish an effective date no later than July 1st, 2020, where lead agencies across the state had to start using VMT as the metric when evaluating transportation impacts. So the city started using VMT in CEQA analysis back in 2019, relying on guidance that was published by the Office of Planning and Research in 2018. And the city has been and continues to apply that recommendation and guidance from OPR absent locally adopted guidelines, and uses screening and other recommendations from OPR that includes a threshold of 15% below the citywide average for assessing VMT impacts. So that is what is in effect today. So we have gone through a multi-step process to get where we are with the draft guidelines before you this evening. In 2018, the City of Petaluma initiated a VMT discussion with a joint planning commission and council workshop, and subsequently council authorized a contract with transportation consultants Farren Pierce to develop local guidelines for VMT implementation through a public process. That process involved the formation of the Vehicle Miles Traveled Technical Advisory Committee, the TAC, comprised of appointed representatives from each of the city bodies listed here, as well as staff from Public Works and Transit, and representatives from Sonoma County Transportation Authority, Sonoma County, and Caltrans. The Technical Advisory Committee convened for 3 meetings. The first 2 focused on the key components of the VMT program, and the third provided an opportunity for TAC members to weigh in on the draft BMT implementation guidelines themselves. So the draft guidelines that are before you, before the Planning Commission this evening, is the culmination of that effort, and it incorporates those advisory comments received from the Technical Advisory Committee. The role of the Planning Commission is to consider the draft guidelines, offer any feedback or comments, and serve as a recommending body to Council, who will be ultimately responsible for taking action on adoption of the guidelines. And assuming that Planning Commission does advance that recommendation this evening, we're targeting the June 21st Council meeting to bring that forward. So the draft BMT implementation guidelines are presented in full in Exhibit 1 to Attachment A of the staff report before you this evening on this item. The guidelines do apply exclusively to new discretionary projects that are subject to environmental review, and they lay out the procedures to follow and the thresholds to apply when evaluating transportation impacts. The guidelines do not tackle BMT from existing trips generated by established uses citywide. Rather, they provide a standardized process for assessing transportation impacts using the BMT metric for new discretionary projects, both development review and municipal projects, and they would bring the city into compliance with SB 743. So that's kind of a high-level summary. I'm gonna pass it over to Matt Goyne to walk us through some of the key components of the guidelines and provide a bit more detail on the discussion and input that we received from the Technical Advisory Committee.
Great, thanks, Olivia. As Olivia mentioned, my name is Matt Goyne and I'm with Farren Pierce. We were hired to help the city make this transition to VMT from level service. And my colleague Ian Barnes is here as well, who helped lead a lot of the TAC meetings to help us answer questions. So first, I'd like to start just by defining VMT. VMT stands for vehicle miles traveled and represents the number of vehicles multiplied by the distance each vehicle travels. As shown in this example, one vehicle traveling 1 mile is 1 VMT, while 4 vehicles traveling 10 miles equals 40 VMT. Therefore, a household or business that generates more vehicle trips with longer trip lengths is going to generate higher VMT, while one that replaces some of those trips with walking, biking, or transit, or shorter vehicle trips would generate less VMT. As Olivia mentioned, the state of California selected VMT to measure traffic impacts with the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, creating safer streets, and encouraging infill development patterns. So the state's Office of Planning and Research, otherwise known as OPR, created guidance that outlines a series of steps and decisions that all jurisdictions must take to adopt VMT. OPR's technical advisory provides recommendations for each of these steps. And the city's technical advisory committee considered each of them in making their recommendations to the Planning Commission and the City Council. These are all outlined in detail in the SB 743 implementation report in your packet. I'll just quickly mention what these steps are, and then I'll go through each of them individually. First, the Petaluma must decide what VMT metrics to measure, and then how to measure them via a selected method. Next, Petaluma must decide how much VMT represents a significant impact and what types of projects can be screened from further VMT analysis. And finally, Petaluma must decide what type of mitigation is appropriate to reduce or offset the significant levels of VMT impact for select projects. So OPR recommended that per capita metrics are used for residential and office uses to evaluate the efficiency of the location of the project rather than just the size of the project. This ensures that the metric achieves the goal of encouraging infill development and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For residential uses, the TAC recommended measuring the total amount of VMT generated per household divided by the number of residents compared to the citywide average. For office uses, the TAC recommended measuring the total commute VMT per employee compared to the regional average. And for retail uses, the TAC recommended measuring the total VMT within the city of Petaluma. This is slightly different because retail has the effect of shifting trips around rather than just creating new trips that did not exist previously when designed properly. Additional information is available in the SB 743 report about unique land uses as they need to generally be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. OPR recommended using a travel demand model to calculate these VMT metrics. There are 3 candidate models that we evaluated with the TAC. That includes the Sonoma County Transportation Authority model, the City of Petaluma's model, and the MPC model. The TAC recommended using the Sonoma County Transportation Authority model because it provides enough detail within Petaluma and is the most recently calibrated model to local conditions. The SCTA also perform routine updates to the model, which reduces the need for Petaluma to maintain a separate model. Shifting to one of the most challenging conversations, the TAC deliberated over 2 meetings on the level of VMT that should represent a significant impact. Retail was relatively easy in that the TAC agreed with the net zero threshold for retail projects, which is appropriate to ensure that they don't generate additional traffic on city streets within Petaluma, although they may redistribute traffic within the city to closer locations. There was a lot of discussion around the appropriate threshold for residential and office. The options considered included OPR's recommended 15% threshold, a threshold of 16.8%, which is the reduction of automobile-only VMT that's required to achieve the state's greenhouse gas emission goals based on a recent analysis conducted by the California Air Resource Board. And also higher thresholds were discussed as well. Based on most of the respondents preferring a higher threshold than 15% in the final TAC meeting, staff is recommending adopting a 16.8% threshold. This threshold demonstrates climate leadership as it exceeds many other climate-focused jurisdictions such as Davis, Berkeley, or San Francisco, which have adopted 15%. That being said, the TAC also recommended that revising this threshold, that we should revisit this threshold after completing the general plan and climate action plan to ensure its alignment with the city goals. OPR also provides guidance that not all projects should require a full VMT analysis. The TAC recommended adopting 3 screening criteria listed here, including the low VMT generating area projects, projects that are near high quality transit, and small projects. TAC also recommended adjusting some other screening criteria, such as not allowing drive-throughs in VMT screening, reducing the amount of retail that can be screened to 30,000 square feet from 50,000 square feet in OPR's guidance, and also allowing the city staff to retain discretion to deny VMT screening if appropriate. There was a lot of detailed conversation around the appropriate level of affordable housing that could be screened out because OPR is vague in its guidance. But based on the conversation that we had, staff recommended 100% affordable housing projects be screened, just for clarity. I want to show you this map to demonstrate what the low VMT and transit adjacent screening options would look like. The green areas represent areas where projects would be screened out from further VMT analysis, as long as they match city requirements such as not exceeding parking minimums, achieving minimum floor area ratios, and not replacing existing affordable housing. I will note that the low VMT areas are pretty limited within Petaluma due to the high 16.8% threshold. This just means that VMT analysis would be required for projects in those yellow and orange locations, which indicate the relative ability of a project to achieve a less than significant level of impact with additional mitigation measures. This map and the one for office uses will be updated as Sonoma County model is updated with new information and when transit infrastructure changes. The final step in the SB 743 implementation process was to develop guidelines for mitigating significant VMT impacts. The report includes a variety of industry standard measures that studies have shown to have quantifiable VMT reductions for settings like Petaluma. This includes site design changes, walking, biking, or transit infrastructure, and transportation demand management measures. The measures shown in the report are not intended to be exhaustive, but are meant to provide guidance about the type of VMT reductions that are achievable for CEQA defensibility purposes. This does not exclude other creative approaches to reducing VMT that individual projects may come up with that are locally appropriate. Since the question comes up a lot, I do want to clarify that greenhouse gas reduction measures are not necessarily appropriate for VMT reduction because they do not achieve the same co-benefits of reduced vehicle travel, such as improved roadway safety. Similarly, TDM measures and planning best practices that don't have quantifiable evidence may not be appropriate for the CEQA process, but could be required locally through planning codes and checklists. So this wraps up the steps that are required for the VMT implementation process, and I'd be happy to provide more information about any of the discussions or decisions that were made along the way during the questions period. Before I do hand it back to Olivia, I would like to share some brief information about the tax recommendation to pursue a citywide VMT reduction program tailored to Petaluma after this SB 743 process. So this was based on the city's declared climate emergency, that the TAC expressed a strong interest in developing a more holistic approach that as a next step to evaluate ways to reduce VMT both for existing and future residents, employees, and visitors. To start this process, the appendices of the report include a menu of quantifiable as well as supportive TDM measures that represent planning best practices for site level and community level VMT reduction. A citywide VMT program would allow the city to work towards climate neutrality while balancing both the CEQA process and going through a planning code type checklist approach that would allow a more holistic planning that is not necessarily constrained by the limits of CEQA or available data today. With that, I'll hand it back to Olivia.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So the next step that Matt was just talking about is really intended to come after the current action at hand, the current item, which is to formalize the local procedures for evaluating vehicle miles traveled under CEQA and getting the VMT metric established and those thresholds adopted, and having the procedures on hand for use in discretionary projects moving forward. As you've heard, the recommended threshold at 16.8% below the citywide per capita average continues to establish Petaluma as a leader in adopting regulation to advance climate resilience and work towards the carbon neutrality goal. Adoption of the draft VMT guidelines is really just the first of many subsequent actions that the city may take to develop a really robust local VMT program that expands not just to new discretionary projects, but established uses as well. Next slide. So the VMT implementation guidelines is not subject to CEQA. It does not meet the definition of a project and does not constitute a direct or indirect physical impact. And adoption of the guidelines by the city does achieve compliance with the state's legislative mandate and will be used through a regulatory process, through the CEQA review process that involves procedures for protection of the environment. So for these reasons, the action at hand, the draft VMT implementation guidelines, are exempt from CEQA themselves, although they establish CEQA regulations. Really briefly, just touching on the public noticing and outreach effort and opportunities for public comment. So there was numerous opportunities throughout this process, both through the appointment meetings and the technical advisory committee meetings for public comment and participation. The city has also maintained a webpage throughout this process with information relating to those decisions, upcoming meetings, links to other resources, staff reports, and whatnot. And then in advance of the Planning Commission meeting this evening, an 8th-page ad in the Argus was published because this is a citywide activity that applies citywide. And no comments were received leading up to this meeting tonight on this item. So with that, the staff's recommendation is that Planning Commission adopt a resolution, which is included as attachment A to the staff report, recommending that City Council adopt local draft VMT, vehicle miles traveled, implementation guidelines for conducting transportation analyses pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act, establishing CEQA thresholds of significance for vehicle miles traveled, and identifying VMT screening and mitigation options to bring the city into compliance with Senate Bill 743. And as Matt mentioned, also as a next step, looking to the Planning Commission to consider the request from the TAC on next steps, that the TAC reconvene following adoption of the guidelines to focus on identifying some citywide mitigation strategies that could be advanced in the near term and immediately. So with that, that wraps up staff's presentation, and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Olivia and Matt. I appreciate that presentation. It's very thorough. And we will, before we go on to commissioner comment, we'll go now to public comment. So again, public comment is for things on this agenda item. And I'm going to go ahead and ask if you are a member of the public and you would like to comment on this agenda item to raise your hand, and we'll let moderator Eric Roberts take it over from here.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I'll just provide a few moments for any of our attendees to raise their hand. It appears that we don't have any public comment on this item. I'll pass it back to Chair Bauer.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Roberts will now close public comment for that, and we'll go.
Chair Bauer, I think you muted yourself.
Am I still muted? I'm good now? Okay. Yes, I don't know what happened there. Okay, well, thank you very much. And we'll go on to commissioner comments now. And I think I saw, I'm not sure, but I think I saw Vice Chair Alonso's hand raised first, so we'll go with him.
Thank you, Chair Bauer, and thank you, staff and the consulting team for a great staff report and presentation. Very thorough and helpful. My question was on one of the aspects of the VMT screening for affordable housing. And throughout the guidelines and in the report, it mentions 100%. And I was just wondering, were there discussions at the TAC about what that makeup would be? Would that be 100% very low units, or what? Can you kind of just walk us through what that would look like? Would that be up to staff to review that, and how the applicant's proposing that for a screening proposal?
Yeah, that particular piece of it didn't actually come up. The TAC sort of deliberated on the location more of where the affordable would go. From the CEQA guidelines and the direction, my read would be that any level of affordability would qualify for this, and as long as it was 100% affordable. And there's some other carve-outs under CEQA as well for exemptions and screening for affordable projects that meet a certain target and threshold. Matt, did you want to add anything, or Ian, on that specific item?
I think you covered it. Thanks, Olivia.
Okay. Do any other jurisdictions in the area specify the affordable housing ratio in terms of the screening process?
In terms of the mix of housing, not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, some jurisdictions are. It's kind of a range. There are some with 90%. There's some with 50%. 50%, of course, is consistent with SB 35. And ultimately, it's a local case-by-case decision, and there's not clear guidance from the state on this one.
But Vice Chair Alonso, you're asking for the level of affordability, right? You're asking, is it 100% lower incomes, or does moderate, or as long as it's 100% deed restricted, moderate, low, or very low, right? I think that's what you're
correct. Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to try to explore more about more flexibility to promote very low and low, because that's where we're hurting as a city, right? And so as a potentially just as a thought discussion for tonight to raise that. I certainly support the screening proposals and the 100% affordability. I'm just trying to understand if there's different levels we could discuss or offer, or at least ask the council to consider.
Yeah, so at the 100% right now, any modification to that would be, you know, a reduction, right? So,
but I think what he's saying is not the 100%. It would be, is it 100% of low income or 100% that can be made up of any variety, or what is the income level, not the percentage? A clarification.
Right. So I think with the state's intent with the housing crisis is that any level is intended to benefit from this screening. But certainly the city may, you know, want to further incentivize those areas that are needed. But I'm not sure how we would do that here, since we're already at we're recommending 100%. Across the board, whether you're low, very low, or
right. But I guess, you know, some projects come to us and there's 10% very low, right? Some have 5%, some have no very low units, whereas some have moderate. Half of them are deed restricted as moderate. And so I'm just trying to think of ways that we could be flexible. So if maybe an applicant comes and they have 25% very low, would they be eligible for the screening that's laid out in these guidelines? So I don't know if we need to pick a number right now, but I just wanted to kind of raise that as a discussion on how we kind of parse that out, because I think it's a good idea. It sounds like the TAC discussed it, and it seems like a worthwhile goal. I just wanted to see if we could just drill into that. But
yeah, I'm not aware, and Ian and I are just confirmed it, but I'm not aware of any jurisdictions using a specific, you know, AMI for the CEQA screening process. Certainly, it's accomplished through many ways through the planning code process. Yeah, that is something that we have to remember that this is one step of the process here. It's whether you conduct a VMT analysis or not. Certainly, the VMT analysis can account for the provision of affordable housing.
so, for example, a project that has a higher, it's a mix, and some are moderate and some are low. They get their VMT analysis. They get a benefit because affordable units generate fewer trips when you're doing the methodology. So in that way, it's kind of reflective in the overall VMT by that use, because they have incorporated affordable units.
Yeah, and a project that's 25% affordable, you know, that would be accounted for, but it's not necessarily, can't be presumed to be a less than significant impact based on just what OPR has provided.
And then just layering onto that, we have to consider the location. So if that affordable project or a mix of affordable and moderate or market occurred within the half mile of the transit, it would screen out just due to location. So there's, you know, that to consider as well.
okay, thank you. That's
Great,
all I have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. We'll move on to Commissioner Hooper.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. One question I had actually related back to the affordable housing screening. Does the screening, is it 100% screening regardless of where it is in the city?
Yeah, so that's where the draft has landed. But as I mentioned, there was some discussion about by some members of the TAC suggesting that not all areas of the city might be appropriate. But when we kind of furthered that conversation and really looked at the urban growth boundary already in effect and the need for affordable housing, we felt like 100% affordable, that staff's recommendation that it should screen out regardless of where it is, but that's absolutely something that could be discussed, or the Planning Commission could weigh in on to advise council on that decision point.
Were they worried that this would become a method of bypassing inclusionary issues? Because we already have an issue with some of our projects about making arrangements so that affordable projects end up more on the outskirts. One of the largest problems with affordability is making sure, especially for the very low income units, that people have good access to transit, good access to services, and are closer to the urban core. So I guess my concern with this is that we've exempted out affordability for an understandable reason, but in the long run, just make it easier for housing developments to avoid actual inclusionary goals, which could end up harming the people we're trying to help. Was there discussion about that, or was this just really a focus on as many units as possible?
That particular conversation did not come up, but I don't know if our 100% affordable projects are subject to inclusionary. I guess I'm looking to Heather on.
They're not, but I think what Commissioner Hooper is saying is this give an out where we're actually incentivizing putting affordable housing further away from transit, when regardless if it's tied directly to our inclusionary housing requirement, it's one of our just overarching goals is to make sure that affordable housing is offered close to services and close to like all housing, but particularly to make sure that affordable housing is placed in areas with access to transit. One thing I would say is that SB 35 right now, if you do 50% affordable under SB 35, you are exempt from CEQA. So you're kind of already able to get there. And then the other thing I would say is there are a lot of areas, and Matt or Olivia or Ian, I can be a little bit dangerous here talking about VMT because right when I think I kind of understand it, there's something that I hadn't realized. But there are a lot of areas in the city that are not way out on the outskirts that have high VMT in that transit zone. And so there are areas that are maybe, I don't know, a mile outside of downtown that you have an issue with higher than the citywide average, and so you can't get it below. So just, I think it's important to rethink the framing of, I think we often think of the areas that are higher in VMT as being way out, and they're not necessarily. So sometimes that could be true, that it might be facilitating our affordable housing further away from transit, but sometimes it's actually facilitating housing in areas that might be the next leg of improving transit availability from the core. But also I think that SB 35 already exempts housing that's 50% at the low or very low from CEQA to begin with. And so it's an interesting kind of topic to think about how much more this might incentivize or not.
Thank you for that clarity, because that was, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have just two quick follow-up thoughts. The city can also deny, at any point, can deny the use of screening. That's in the guidelines. And second, as Heather mentioned, there are some places that are, fairly close to downtown, but the maps that we showed, for example, of low VMT area, it's based on existing data and the existing households that are there today. So if you're talking about putting a multifamily affordable housing project in a place where there's only high income single family housing, right, that's where you have to do the VMT analysis, recognizing that the VMT generated by this project could be a lot lower, especially an affordable housing project, than what the map shows, because it can only represent the data that we have today.
I think you're muted.
Oh, yeah, we can't hear you, Ian, but it does not look like your mute is on. Not sure what's happening there. No.
Sounds like
Very
you're
quiet.
still muted.
Well, thank you very much for that clarification. I can see where this could both go to the concern I was having in the first place with regards to inclusionary, but I can also see where in some respects, this could actually help increase affordability for high inclusionary or for high VMT rates. One of the things you said relates to something else I had a question about, which had to do with the screening for locations that are within a mile of transit. And I saw a reference of it in the report. I just wanted to confirm, even though it's within a mile of major transit, I assume there's also factors employed for how much parking they're providing in the proposal, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, one of the provisions to qualify for that screening is that you cannot exceed the parking standard and you have to meet a certain FAR. And so we saw that play out, for example, with the Heinz project downtown that was adjacent to the station, but they were proposing a slightly higher parking. And so a full VMT analysis was required for that one.
And in this situation, because we still have minimums, it would be the parking standard would be the existing minimum, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. One question about retail. You had mentioned that it's change of location within boundary, and I just wanted to get a clear sense of what that looked like, especially with regional traffic. You know, I'm honestly thinking about the meeting last week we had people going to the Target from neighboring city, like how that starts to impact VMT.
Yeah, and so that's where the screening threshold was set at 30,000 square feet to try to get under some of those larger projects. The screening for retail is meant to focus on locally serving retail. You know, if you're going to build coffee shops, you know, in a walkable development, you don't want to have to conduct a whole VMT analysis for that. And yeah, Target is an example of a project that has to be thought about critically. You know, Costco, Home Depot, some of these kind of big box stores that draw from outside of Petaluma. The effect where a project would be less than significant in Petaluma would be, say, adding a grocery store to an area where there isn't great grocery store access, and therefore people are driving shorter distances to get to that grocery store. And that's why you can set a net zero threshold for retail.
Got it. That makes more sense. And then with regards to redevelopment projects, I know we don't have that as much here these days, but just thinking hopefully for the future. It's noted that it's kind of up to the city's discretion with what that looks like. Is it discretion in terms of, oh, this is now residential, so we're going to apply this threshold. This is that. This is now retail, so we will be applying this threshold. Or is the city freed up to create its own standard for that project?
Well, we are directed to look at all of the uses. So if it's a mixed use project, then we look at the residential piece using the residential threshold, and we look at the retail piece using the retail threshold.
But is the question if, for instance, it was a strip mall and it was redeveloped as residential? Is that what you're?
That's really what I'm trying to get at. Thank you.
Then we would be looking at it. I guess Matt or Olivia, I mean, we would have CEQA because it would be a project under CEQA. It would be a discretionary review. So CEQA would be triggered. Would we look at it under the residential, but then look at the delta between the new VMT and what had been there under the retail VMT? And that would be what we'd be looking at, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, anytime you are netting out from an existing use, you get the benefit of those changed VMT that are no longer being spent. So that's accurate.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. And about the 16.8% threshold, which I'm personally in favor of us going as far as we can with that regard. Is there a long-term threshold we could be aiming for? I understand 16.8 puts us above most of the communities in the area. And I understand that we're really focused on getting to 2030 and meeting our goals there. But just looking at the report and then looking through the plan and how we've got kind of 2045, 2050, and other state goals that'll be coming, I'm sure will be coming forward as time goes on. Was there ever talk of a percentage that could really set us up for long-term success, or does 16.8 really get us there?
Well, there's definitely a lot to consider when looking at the thresholds and adoption. And one of the biggest thing is that it's supported by substantial evidence. And that body of evidence exists through OPR at the 15% and through the Air Resources Board at that 16.8%. And so that's why we're feeling really comfortable with the 16.8%. But there was quite a bit of discussion about considering a higher threshold and what would it take to get the city to achieve the 2030 net neutral goal. And the best approach is really to revisit this threshold once we have gone through the general plan update process and we have established our climate action plan and our climate adaptation plan, so that those can, then the threshold can be revisited to align with that local plan that has now integrated a new land use plan and policies and all of the things that will set the city on the course to achieve that reduction.
Understood.
And I'll add that the data source for this, the California Air Resource Board, they update their estimates of how we're going to achieve our statewide goals of carbon reduction every few years. And so that information, new information, would be available that would take into account how well the state is and individual communities are doing at reducing VMT. And so that's the type of information that could be taken into account, as well as a cap that a climate action plan that clearly says how much to get to these goals, how much does it need to be from reducing VMT, how much does it need to be through electrification, every other measure that's out there.
Excellent. And out of curiosity, I assume this is probably a little too extra, but would there be any kind of way to automate those increases, kind of like a COLA, as those reports come in and they modify the percentage?
I would love that. We'll have to give that some thought. I think that any change to a citywide adopted threshold does require a public process. So I don't think there's an automated system that we could do for the threshold itself. Now that I've talked through it.
Although Olivia, I would add, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. One of the important things about CEQA, though, is that the VMT analysis baseline, we're saying 15% below an average or 16.8% below an average. That average gets recalculated over time. So as the city becomes more VMT efficient going forward, the threshold of significance will get more stringent for new development because that average keeps dropping as the city becomes more sustainable. So while the percentage number maybe doesn't change, kind of like a COLA situation, the other part of that calculation, the citywide average or the regional average, would be decreasing over time.
Thanks for that clarification, Ian.
I think that might be the most beautiful part about this. I do love that the more successful you are, the harder it gets to try and get around it. It's fantastic. I had a question about mitigations. If assuming I understood correctly, really tonight we're moving this forward, then TAC will be meeting to really talk about the mitigations portion of this in more detail. Because I think I went through that portion the most times, if only because I kept thinking about how beautiful it'd be to integrate public transit and active transit into so many things as a mitigation item. And I was looking at the San Diego case study that you all included, which I was really appreciative of, and was just wondering, in terms of where, because I saw the chart that you showed, but in terms of where these general strategies are looking to go, is there an appetite for really making sure that the mitigations are not only following the letter of the law, but also helping us when it comes to adding bus terminals, adding bike paths, making sure that we have more mixed use, making sure there's teeth to that? Like, is that really the focus that TAC has had thus far? Because I I don't want to start running through possible mitigations if that's where they're already thinking. But I just wanted to get kind of a temperature check on where mitigations were going.
Sure. So I think there's two things to think about and multiple more, but kind of two pots that I think about. One is sort of good planning practice, right? Those are the things that are, everything should have wide sidewalks. We should have good bike parking. We should have lockers. We should have bus shelters. These are all kind of good planning practice that projects should be adopting and designing to. And those are not necessarily quantifiable under CEQA. So the other bucket is what is quantifiable mitigation reduction that is supported by evidence that is allowed under CEQA. And so there's these two kind of different pots that we're dealing with. And so for this purpose and for CEQA, we have to have quantifiable mitigation reduction strategies. And so that the things in that bucket are much smaller because the body of evidence is not as robust, because this is a relatively new thing, and data is continuing to evolve and come in, and so that is why we've kind of outlined that next step is how do we get there? What are the top priorities and the most effective quantifiable mitigation strategies that the city can pursue and roll out in the near term. And so that's the purpose of that next step, is to kind of hone in on a handful, a menu of options, if you will, of what those quantifiable mitigation reduction strategies would be.
Got it. And does this require both mitigation for the project, but then any kind of citywide mitigation planning as well, or just project specific?
So the draft BMT guidelines sort of say that there are mitigation options, and those are, everything is on the table. They just have to be supported by substantial evidence and quantifiable. So these BMT guidelines apply on a project level, and so individual projects would be prompted, if they exceed a threshold, to mitigate. If they can't mitigate on site, that is where the offsite and the citywide come into play, and that's the gap that we have right now, which is we don't have a citywide program. And so that's the next piece of this, is to create that citywide program that projects that can't mitigate on site can contribute to realize a reduction citywide, and the city gets the benefit and the project gets a reduced BMT because we have measured and quantified the value of the contribution to that citywide program to achieve a citywide reduction in BMT.
Fantastic, thank you. And that was one part of this that, even going back to when it came up at PVAC and then at Transit, that was a little hard to grapple with. I understand this metric had been passed as being more efficient, but it's a little bit odd that some projects can sail through even without having some quantifiable mitigation to meet. Was that in the underlying implementation from the state, or is that a change that was made later?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
What I'm trying to get to, and I realize I kind of circled a little bit on that. Projects are still able to go through this process even though they can't meet on-site mitigation. And that considering the purpose of this program and of the metric seems like an odd capability to me in the process. I was just curious if that is by design from the state or something more unique to the area.
Well, so CEQA has a process for projects that can't meet a threshold, and it's a conclusion that's called significant and unavoidable. And what that means is that there's no feasible mitigation, even though those have been considered and exhausted, that would reduce that impact to less than significant. And then what is required in order for that environmental document to be certified, first of all, it's immediately kicked into an EIR. And then for that EIR to be certified, the city, the lead agency, must adopt a statement of overriding considerations saying that despite the exceedance of BMT, the project offers a tremendous benefit in some way. And so there's a justification for why that override is needed. So I think I guess I don't want to speculate about what the state was thinking, but CEQA has that process in place now for impacts that can't be avoided. And I think that the state was really looking at this statewide, and it certainly is more of a burden to meet those thresholds in more suburban communities and like Petaluma, whereas higher density city centers are able to kind of benefit from those per capita efficiencies that they get.
Right. Thank you for reclarifying the CEQA connection for this. I keep viewing this as its own process, even though it's very clear it's running on that same line. One more question that I have, not related explicitly to this, but just an outreach question. You noted the 1/8 page in the newspaper. Was that the only place this was noticed?
Yeah, so typically in advance of public meetings, we will, notice property owners within 1,000 feet of the site, but here it's citywide. So when we have citywide projects, that is our standard practice, is that we do an 8th page ad. And then in addition to that, we have been maintaining the VMT webpage that I mentioned. And so that has been updated and maintained with documents as they become available and staff reports as they're published and links to hearings. So that was also a resource for the community as well.
Okay. Did this go in the newsletter at least? Or at least the VMT website? I'm only thinking this through because I brought this up last meeting, and I'm not trying to retread the same argument, but a lot of folks are probably going to see this more online, on Nextdoor, maybe in the newsletter through eBlast, but not as much in the ads on the Argus. And I was just trying to think about making that a little bit easier. That's all. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hooper. Now move on to Council Liaison Fisher.
Thank you. I actually have a more general citywide question in terms of the effect of moving from LOS to VMT, and that typically projects that do a traffic analysis and they say, okay, you're going to impact this intersection over here and you can't put in a right turn lane, but you can contribute to our traffic impact fees, and apparently we've got a bundle of money right now that's like 26 million from these fees. And how do we see this movement from LOS to VMT shifting those pots of money? So if we're going to mitigation that has to do with transit and pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, obviously we're not collecting fees any longer based on LOS and traffic impacts. Is that correct? And I've been dying to ask this question now for the past year since this came up.
I'll start, and then this might be kind of a team effort. I saw Dylan perk up too. So our development impact fees are based on our general plan, and the required transit traffic improvements that were required to bring growth with the general plan. So things like at the time, the crosstown connectors were a major source of, that's how we were going to address impacts of general plan growth. And so the development impact fees were based on those. Those still stand at the moment. They're still in our policy document. They're still the, what is called for, and those fees are still valid under that. Now, I would imagine that when we do our new general plan, and I do not mean to I feel like I just keep saying general plan, but when we do our new general plan, I would assume that there is going to be a major discussion about a fee structure associated with any changes that would come out of that plan in terms of how we are going to move people around town, how are we going to, address the impacts with that growth that's anticipated in the general plan. But until we have that, we have the general plan, we have the infrastructure improvements that general plan calls for, and we have the fee structure that is in place based on those improvements.
So we don't.
How'd I do, Dawn?
That was good. I was going to add to, loss of service, it's still an impact, even if it's not going to be in our EIRs going forward. So it's still something that the city is going to look after, and we can use our development fees to try to address it right now.
Okay, thank you. And then I wish somebody would explain these VMT maps to me. I just don't understand them, and how we came up with these zones. And this is really sort of fundamental to all of this. I'm still trying to understand. So we have various zones in the city, and that's based on what and how?
Go ahead, Matt.
That is based on, those zones are directly from the Sonoma County Transportation Authority model.
Okay.
And I'll just add that those zones are based on similar uses within those zones. So we look at, when those zones are established, we look at what are like uses in that area, what makes sense to lump those into a group. And so we have a number of zones in the city that, run the gamut. But the idea is that they capture, clusters of areas that have similar VMT and travel patterns.
Okay. Yeah. So when we talk about near-term solutions, I just want to put out there free transit, and I'm going to keep saying it, free transit. I don't know how we're going to get there, but I think we need to get to free transit. And also when we talk about other things we can adopt, we talked about wayfinding signage. I'd like to just get an update to our bicycle map that we give out to people. We don't have a current one that says, here's the smart station and here you are. And so when we implement our bike share program, we have nothing that, we don't even have any signage or something we can hand out to somebody who's coming to Petaluma to say, oh, you're going to pick up a bike share, and where are you going to go? Because we don't know. So I'd like to put that on there. And then also increasing the connectivity of our multi-use paths and our bike paths, because many of them don't connect. And I think that's all I have for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. Are there any other commissioner questions at this time?
And through the chair, I do see Jared Hall from Petaluma Transit. He has his hands up. Maybe we can.
Okay, yes, bring him over.
Yeah.
Actually, if I might share, I just had one additional question that I just realized. In one of the near-term items was explore local requirements to increase the EV charging requirements for development projects. And I just had a question about what did we use to determine our existing requirements? Like, how would we evaluate whether we wanted to require more?
It's our EV is only based on Cal Green requirements at the moment. That's the only adopted standard we have.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jared, welcome. Do you have anything to add?
Good evening, everyone. I was just following the discussion. Yeah, I think depending, again, on how everything plays out with the discussion here, tying into the general plan updates, if there's a review of the different things like fee structures and things like that, and if there's demand for doing things differently with transit service, I think we're open to a lot of the ideas that were discussed here today, whether that's things like bus stop improvements to help beef up the transit system as a means to offset VMT and greenhouse gas, or doing service supplements, better service, more frequent service on major corridors. We have project lists ready to go to do those type of improvements. So I think that's something that'll hopefully be part of the discussion as it plays out a bit more, is as part of this discussion, as these projects are being reviewed under the lens of VMT, depending on what the offsets are for the project, I think there's a lot of different transit related and other bike ped type impacts that can be done to offset kind of the mitigations. There's also discussion about kind of what should be done on-site versus off-site. I mean, for my 2 cents, I would say it's always a combination of kind of the two. I would say every project should always have some amount of on-site impact relief, obviously, but then it's also a discussion of what is the best bang for the buck, so to speak. And do you want to do a lot of these improvements to projects that are, further removed from the core of the city, don't have existing services as close to them connecting, or is it more productive on a citywide basis to do the improvements elsewhere, closer to your core, where you have good transit service, good bus stops already, bike paths would have more impact? And so really, I think it's kind of an offset of those items, and every project is some combination of the two that'll have to get sorted out a bit more as we kind of work our way through this process and develop it.
Great. Thank you very much, Jared. That's good information. I'll just ask one question, and I'm not sure if there's a good answer, but I'm wondering if there's any unintended consequences in terms of dense housing. Like if we're talking about a development that is not qualified to be screened out, is not really affordable, then is there an incentive for the developer to make it less dense so that they meet their VMT, or is that not so, just because then there would be less residents living there, or is that somehow accounted for in the calculations?
Yeah, density is accounted for in the calculation, and in fact, density is one of the biggest reductions that you can get by increasing the density. So I don't see a reverse incentive there to go the other way. I would see it being more higher density would be incentivized under VMT.
Good.
But Olivia, can I clarify with that too? There are times when adding density doesn't solve a project's VMT issue. So we've seen it both ways. We've seen projects where we as staff have been able to encourage them to increase the density or add ADUs or some of those kind of things that kind of play into multiple objectives for the city. We're getting higher density, which we want. We're getting more diverse types of housing. I believe inclusionary housing also can reduce the VMTs, correct? Can I see a nod from Matt or Ian? Doesn't sometimes affordable. So sometimes we're able to use it to get things we think would make a better project. But then we've also had times when a project has exceeded a threshold or not able to bring the VMT down enough, and throwing more density at doesn't solve the problem. So it can kind of go, my experience has been it's kind of can go both ways. Sometimes it can be helpful and it can help us get things we would like to see as a city from a project. And then there's other time that density doesn't help. It doesn't get them where they need to be from a VMT standpoint.
Thank you, because I was thinking about the Davidoff project, and that had VMT issues, and that's pretty low density residential.
And that I think doesn't help to add more units out at Davidoff. That doesn't reduce their VMT.
Right. Okay. But it wouldn't have helped to have less either.
Well, they can't have less for other reasons. So we're getting, that one's getting complicated, I think. I think that there creates other issues with that because they're at the low end of their allowable density, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, I just was worried about that, but it seems there's workarounds to make sure that doesn't happen. So for the most part, with your concerns noted, Ms. Hines.
We're learning a lot too at the staff level. You know, we have looked at different projects, and what might work for a VMT solution on one project may not on another project. There are unique circumstances on a project by project level. And then the other thing I would note is the first project into a neighborhood, there are sometimes things that project can do to mitigate their VMT, and the next project comes in. And that project that came in before it did kind of all the like immediate neighborhood things that can be done to reduce VMTs, and there's not as much direct mitigation options that that next project would have. And so then we run into issues with that too. So it's definitely nuanced.
Great. Thank you very much. Commissioner Hooper?
Yeah, I just had one more question. I was listening to the discussion. I was thinking about the point that you had made with regards to sites that we would think would be lower VMT being higher VMT, and then now subsequent discussions that have followed. And I just, on a basic level, wanted to ask, and with an understanding that this is a question of areas being determined for a certain level of VMT without a project being considered, but how are low VMT areas being designated?
Yeah. Matt, you want to jump in?
Sure. Well, there are very few low VMT areas as shown in that map, based on the 16.8 threshold. And there were a few more, like downtown would have been screened out with the 15% threshold. So you could kind of see the gradient there. But they were determined because they have a mix of residential, and there's a job, and where there's a jobs housing, there's a lot more in areas where there's a lot more jobs. That is one factor that can allow you to reduce your VMT by adding residential. So when we developed those maps, we made sure that, for example, areas on the outside of the city, that have a mobile home park, for example, on the far western side of the city there, that's a mobile home park is going to generate less VMT. But ultimately, that's not representative of the type of developments that might move in there. So that would not be screened out. So really, it just came down to, there's only these locations that had the mix of existing multifamily housing that might be built there in the future, and kind of the other factors that reduce VMT.
And then on the job centers component of this, and this might be covered with the Sonoma County Transit Agency data, but is this taking into account commuter data for jobs that effectively aren't being worked by folks who live here in Petaluma? And that might not be a reasonable thing to provide just because of the consistency of the data, but I was just curious to know if that factored in.
Can you restate your question?
When looking at the job centers in Petaluma, which it seems are a critical factor for lower VMT areas, is there a consideration for commuter data for people commuting in, especially from up north to work in the city but not living in the city?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So there's a similar map for office, and in general, Petaluma has a lower VMT per capita, actually, than the regional average. For employment uses, we have to look at it regionally, because, we're comparing, if you locate employment in Petaluma versus, other locations. And one of the reasons why it is actually slightly lower is because of it's actually closer to more households, affordable housing, than other places in the region, where people have to travel farther distances, such as Silicon. Basically, everything in the region is weighted by Silicon Valley and San Mateo that have really long vehicle trip lengths. So ultimately, the maps and the analysis for employment uses will take into account that fact that employees that work in Petaluma, whether or not they live in Petaluma, generate on average less VMT than the regional average. And it just depends on, the site characteristics of how you design that project and where you put it, whether it would screen out or whether it would be a significant impact.
Okay. I'm a little concerned that the average we're being weighted against is one that I can only imagine would be quite high, but that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hooper. Vice Chair Alonso?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would it be appropriate now to start offering comments? Is that okay?
I think so. Yeah, I don't think I see. Are there any other questions? Or I think it looked like we were wrapping up questions, but yeah, I think you could start with comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'm in support of the staff recommendation tonight. I think it's a solid report and analysis, so I would be in favor of the 16.8% that's being proposed. I'm also in agreement that the TAC should continue to meet and think about ways for mitigation strategies after this goes to the council. I do appreciate that staff and the consultants discussed that there would still be discretion with the screening process. So I think that's important. So that can still have some oversight. And I think this is just a really important resolution tonight. We've been discussing this for many years, and I think it's just really exciting to see this get off the ground. It aligns with our Climate Action Commission priority number 5. So I think, we're making really good progress here tonight, and I think it's really exciting to see this kind of get off the ground. So in terms of some of the questions that staff asked about short-term framework for some mitigation strategies, again, I think, we got to go back to EV charging and supporting more EV charging in the city. I think the Berkeley example is a solid one. I think we need to have that here in Petaluma to streamline that process for property owners, residential owners. But I also, again, I think we need better EV strategies in our public places, especially downtown Petaluma. Again, we have one large parking garage that has 0 EV stations. So now that is more complicated because the city of Petaluma does not own that garage or maintain it. But again, I think we just need to think about ways to incentivize and be creative to increase EV charging capacity. I agree with Councilmember Fisher on the free transit idea. I think that's an excellent, very maybe hard to reach, but I think we should be talking about it. I mean, we have to do everything we can to promote transit in Petaluma. And again, the biggest thing we always keep to talk about a lot is the parking maximum and revisiting that. So I think that's another worthy short-term goal that we can hopefully accomplish before the general plan update. So again, I just want to thank staff for their excellent work here and the consultants, and it's an exciting proposal tonight. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vice Chair Alonso. Commissioner Hooper?
Had I realized we were going to comment, I would have just continued from my last question into comment. But I did want to say that I fully support this moving forward, especially at the 16.8% threshold. I also similarly want to see the TAC meeting after this to go through mitigations. I remember how they were meeting before. It'd be great to see it more frequently with more updates to the public and more opportunities to just see how we can get a jump start on this before we've gone through our general plan process and to see where this can help some of the discussions we've already had. I keep thinking about the climate action framework that we just had the presentation on and how this wonderfully relates to that, especially when we're thinking about more ways to reduce VMTs by getting people to take more rides on public transportation and to see less uses of cars. I do have concerns though about how commuters are being accurately captured. I do have some concerns still with regards to how affordable housing is being screened. I do recognize that there are state bills that frankly limit how we can measure for that. And there are some scenarios where this might improve the situation when it comes to more inclusionary development in the city. I do think that's something we desperately need to keep monitoring though. Outside of this though, I'll be very excited to see what the monitoring programs look like going forward and what the measurable CEQA mitigations end up being that come out of this. I really appreciate that clarification because looking at VMT, it almost looks like this wonderful tool for us to get all of these other projects that have been stuck or delayed pass through this mitigation. But if it really is just a measurable mitigation through CEQA, then I think that leads to interesting conversations about how we end up finding ways to get things like wayfinding improve transit, and all of that to actually pan out in a measurable way, even if there's a creative way to do it. And with that, I just really want to thank the staff and the consultants for all of their time and the thoroughness of the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hooper. And we'll look for feedback from other commissioners, specifically the VMT threshold. And Planning Manager Hines, are you looking for input from us regarding the TAC too? I didn't see that on the items, but I'm glad we're getting feedback on that, but I wasn't sure if that you need that specifically from us.
Olivia, did we pose that as a specific question? I don't recall.
I just brought it up in the presentation because it was something that the TAC had asked to be forwarded on. So it's definitely a next step. So I didn't want to confuse things with the action at hand, but absolutely looking for any feedback on that next step. And what the commissioners who have provided comments so far have said is exactly what we're looking for, supporting that reconvening, and any additional comments or input on that is appreciated.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Olivia, for that clarification. Councilmember Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I always forget on this commission that I have to save my comments for after questions. So you'll take my comments that I already made. But as part of that TAC committee, I was really pleased to see the final result that came forward tonight. I think it really did reflect all of the process and what we went through in those 3 meetings, and the sort of where we came to. So I appreciate that, and I've already said my other comments. So with that, that's all I have.
Great, thank you very much, Councilmember Fisher. Are there any other commissioner comments and feedback? I don't see any. I'm also in support of the 16.8% threshold and the continuance of the TAC. I think this is really great. I think hopefully we'll be able to get this figured out and make it easily understandable going forward in the future, because I think it's a pretty complex concept. And I'm looking forward to seeing it implemented in our development projects coming up. And I think it is a much better way to go than a level of service. So I'm excited to start implementing it once it gets going. If there's no other, I see we're Commissioner Marzo.
Only to echo what my fellow commissioners have already said. Thank you so much to staff and our consultants for a great presentation. As Vice Chair Alonso said, this has been several years in the making, and I think we're really taking some important steps forward. So I really do appreciate everyone's efforts on this, and you know, I think we're going to come out of this stronger and more focused, and I look forward to the evolution of the mitigation measures and us reaching the goals that the city you know, has earmarked for us, and I think we can get there. And thank you to all.
Thank you, Commissioner Marzo. Commissioner Ryder.
Yeah, I generally agree with my fellow commissioners about the directionality, and very much look forward to mitigation measures that translate into real change prospects for how we interact with our environment, both as peds and bicycle riders and everyone else. So I think that's a fantastic suggestion. My request would be, if there's an opportunity over this next interval, whether that's 5 years or not, as we're tracking this new VMT standard, if we could have a report out of the average and how it changes over time, and what those percentage thresholds are, both in surrounding communities and what we're achieving as a community. I think that would be really useful to both just keep a track of and inform that next cycle.
Great, thank you very much, Commissioner Ryder. I think with that, Planning Manager Hines, I think you have feedback from us that you are looking for, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry, did we have a reso?
Yes.
Oh,
we have a
yes, sorry, wait a
I was
minute.
gonna say.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go to Vice Chair Alonso, and maybe he'll recommend that.
Thank you, Chair Bauer. I would make a motion to approve attachment A in the staff report, which is the resolution to the City Council adopting these guidelines and other exhibits mentioned in the report.
I'll second.
Thank you. We have a first and a second, so we will take the roll call vote. Ms. Ellis?
Okay. Bauer,
Yes.
Alonso,
Yes.
Hooper,
Yes.
Marzo,
Yes.
Potter, absent, Ryder,
Yes.
Fisher.
Yes.
Great. With that, that looks like that is going to be sent up to the City Council. And I think that's a wrap for us. We'll go ahead and adjourn the meeting for tonight. And thanks for everybody's hard work and time and dedication to making our city more sustainable and environmentally responsible. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Night, everyone.
Good night.